It was built to move faster than hesitation, and commanded by a man who despised delay. Heinz Guderian believed that war was decided not by caution, but by momentum. To him, tanks were not simply weapons. They were arguments made at speed. When Germany turned east and south with ambitions of rapid decision, Guderian's Second Panzer Army became one of the sharpest instruments of that belief, a formation designed to rupture fronts, exploit confusion, and keep moving long after others would pause. In the early campaigns, the results were devastating. The Second Panzer Army advanced with precision and aggression, driving deep into enemy territory and collapsing resistance through coordination rather than sheer mass. Armor, infantry, artillery, and air support moved as a system, linked by radios and driven by initiative. All breakthroughs were not endpoints. They were invitations to accelerate. Front lines dissolved behind it, command structures collapsed, encirclements closed faster than responses could form. This was mobile warfare at its most confident. But the army's success was inseparable from its commander, and Guderian was never an easy man to command under. He pushed relentlessly, argued openly, and clashed repeatedly with higher authority. Where others obeyed, Guderian debated. Where others paused, he pressed forward. His confidence in armored warfare was absolute, and his tolerance for interference was non-existent. As the war expanded, those tensions deepened. On the Eastern Front, the Second Panzer Army faced distances that punished speed and terrain that resisted movement. Roads vanished, supply lines thinned. The enemy did not collapse. It absorbed pressure, retreated, and returned stronger. What had once been exploitation became overextension. Guderian continued to demand movement. He pushed his formations forward even as logistics strained. He argued against pauses he believed would waste opportunity. And increasingly, he found himself constrained not by the enemy alone, but by strategic decisions made far from the front. The Second Panzer Army fought on, but its role began to change. Offensives slowed into grinding advances, breakthroughs narrowed into corridors, encirclements became harder to seal. When momentum stalled, the consequences were immediate. Counterattacks struck exposed flanks. Supply shortages froze movement. Armor designed for offense was forced into defensive battles it was never meant to sustain indefinitely. Guderian resisted retreat with every instinct he had, but the war no longer rewarded refusal. As the conflict deepened, the Second Panzer Army found itself increasingly committed to holding ground rather than breaking it. Operational freedom narrowed, attrition mounted, experienced crews vanished faster than doctrine could be passed on. Eventually, even Guderian's influence waned. Disagreements with higher command became irreconcilable. The very independence that had fueled early success now clashed with a war increasingly dictated by political interference and inflexible orders. The Second Panzer Army remained dangerous, but it was no longer decisive. Its story is not one of sudden collapse. It is one of erosion, of an army built for movement trapped in a war of endurance, of doctrine confronting scale, of speed encountering limits it could not outrun. Guderian's Second Panzer Army represents both the height of armored ambition and the cost of believing momentum alone could decide a prolonged war. It showed what mechanized warfare could achieve and what it could not survive. Before this continues, take a moment to notice what pace your own day is moving at. Are you listening while things rush around you, or in a quiet pocket of time that finally slowed down? And what hour has found you right now? Guderian believed speed decided everything. This story is better understood when you don't hurry it. This is the story of Guderian's Second Panzer Army, a force that began the war racing ahead of its time and ended it struggling against a reality that no longer moved fast enough to escape. September 16, 1916. It's somewhere along the Somme. The young cavalry lieutenant crouched in a trench that reeked of cordite and stagnant water, watching through field glasses as waves of infantry disappeared into machine gun fire. Heinz Guderian had trained for years to lead mounted charges across open ground, sabers flashing in the sun, horses thundering toward enemy lines in glorious formation. Instead, he was witnessing the methodical slaughter of men caught on barbed wire, their bodies piling up in no man's land, while the cavalry units remained uselessly behind the lines, waiting for a breakthrough that would never come. The horses stamped nervously in their positions miles to the rear, sensing perhaps that their entire purpose in warfare had become obsolete overnight. Guderian scribbled notes in a leather journal, his hand trembling not from fear but from a realization that was beginning to crystallize in his mind. Everything he had learned about warfare was wrong. This wasn't supposed to be how wars worked. Military doctrine for centuries had emphasized mobility, the decisive charge, the flanking maneuver that would shatter enemy formations and send them fleeing. Guderian had studied the campaigns of Napoleon, the cavalry raids of the American Civil War, the sweeping movements that had defined Prussian victories in 1870 and 1871. He had memorized the principles drilled into every German officer: initiative, aggression, speed. But here on the Western Front, none of that mattered. The machine gun had made cavalry charges suicidal. Artillery had turned battlefields into moonscapes. And trench lines stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border with no flanks to turn. Young men were being fed into a meat grinder, gaining yards of mud at the cost of thousands of lives, and the generals kept ordering the same attacks day after day, month after month. Guderian watched a British tank lumber across the battlefield in the distance, moving at walking pace, impervious to rifle fire, crushing barbed wire beneath its treads. It was slow, ungainly, mechanically unreliable, and the cavalry officers around him laughed at its clumsiness. But Guderian didn't laugh. The war ended 2 years later, with Germany defeated, the cavalry having played almost no significant role in 4 years of combat. Guderian returned home as a major. Thus, his career prospects uncertain in a drastically reduced Reichswehr, limited by the Treaty of Versailles to just 100,000 men. The proud Prussian military had been humiliated, stripped of its colonies, forbidden from possessing tanks or aircraft, reduced to a shadow of its former power. Many officers his age left the service entirely, unable to accept the reduced circumstances. But Guderian stayed, driven by a question that gnawed at him through sleepless nights. If cavalry was obsolete, what would replace it? The answer, he suspected, wouldn't come from traditional military thinking. It would require looking at warfare from an entirely new perspective, abandoning centuries of accumulated doctrine, embracing technologies that the old guard dismissed as novelties. Nay, he began reading everything he could find about mechanized warfare, devouring technical manuals, studying the limited tank actions from the Great War, corresponding with engineers and theorists. His fellow officers thought he was wasting his time on a fad that would pass. In 1930, Guderian received an assignment that would change military history. The Reichswehr's Inspectorate of Motorized Troops needed an officer to help develop doctrine for a tiny fleet of armored cars and experimental vehicles. It was considered a backwater posting, a career dead end for an officer who should have been commanding infantry battalions or cavalry regiments. Most of Guderian's peers pitied him, or assumed he'd somehow fallen out of favor with the senior leadership. But Guderian saw it differently. He saw a blank slate. An opportunity to build something entirely new without the burden of institutional resistance. The motorized troops had no established doctrine, no entrenched traditions, no senior generals defending the way things had always been done. It was the perfect laboratory for the ideas that had been forming in his mind since that day watching British tanks on the Somme. He threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, spending 18-hour days studying vehicle specifications, running exercises with prototype vehicles, calculating fuel consumption rates and mechanical reliability data. His wife barely saw him. His children learned to recognize their father by his hunched silhouette bent over technical drawings late into the night. Then Guderian discovered the writings of an eccentric British officer named JFC. In Fuller, and everything clicked into place. Fuller had proposed something radical in his Plan 1919, a scheme to break the trench stalemate by using mass tanks to penetrate deep behind enemy lines, bypassing strong points, collapsing the entire front through paralysis of command rather than attrition of troops. It had never been implemented because the war ended before it could be tested, and the British military establishment had largely dismissed Fuller as a crank with impractical theories. But Guderian read it and saw the future. Not cavalry charges with sabers, not infantry advances with artillery support, but mechanized columns moving at 30 or 40 kilometers per hour, penetrating 50 or 100 kilometers in a single day, turning the enemy's entire defensive system into irrelevance. Oh, speed wouldn't just be an advantage. It would be the doctrine itself. The goal wasn't to push the enemy back meter by meter, it was to move so fast that they couldn't react, to get inside their decision-making cycle, to create chaos in their rear areas before they even realized their front line had been breached. Guderian began sketching out organizational structures, calculating how many tanks you'd need to sustain a breakthrough, what kind of support vehicles would be required, how communications would work at high speeds. His notebooks filled with diagrams that looked nothing like traditional military formations. But when Guderian presented his theories to the Reichswehr leadership in 1933, he encountered a wall of skepticism that nearly ended his career before it began. Senior generals listened politely as he explained his vision of panzer divisions, self-contained mobile forces built around tanks rather than infantry, capable of independent operations deep in enemy territory. Then they tore his proposals apart. Where would you get the fuel for such operations when Germany had no oil reserves? How would you coordinate fast-moving units across vast distances with limited radio equipment? What happens when your precious tanks encounter a prepared defensive line with anti-tank guns? Weren't tanks just expensive targets that any competent infantry division could destroy with proper tactics? The questions came rapid fire, delivered with the barely concealed contempt of men who had spent their careers mastering traditional warfare and saw no reason to abandon proven methods for untested speculation. Guderian defended his ideas with passion and detailed calculations, but he could see he was losing the room. One elderly general actually fell asleep during his presentation. Another pointed out that France had more tanks than Germany could ever hope to build, so trying to compete in armored warfare was foolish. The meeting ended with polite dismissal and no commitment to implement any of Guderian's proposals. He walked out convinced his career was over. Yet something unexpected happened. Adolf Hitler, who had just come to power, heard about Guderian's theories secondhand and demanded a demonstration. The Nazi regime was obsessed with modern technology as a symbol of German resurgence, and the idea of revolutionary tank warfare appealed to Hitler's instinct for dramatic, decisive action. In June 1933, Guderian was given authorization to organize a display of motorized tactics for the Führer. It was his one chance to prove that his theories weren't academic fantasies. Guderian assembled every available vehicle, 36 armored cars and motorcycles, even some trucks painted to look like tanks because Germany didn't have real ones yet, and choreographed an exercise showing how a mechanized unit would conduct a breakthrough operation. Hitler watched intently as the vehicles maneuvered across the training ground, bypassing defensive positions, communicating by radio, supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. When it ended, Hitler turned to his military adjutants and reportedly said, "That's what I need." Guderian had found his patron, not in the traditional military hierarchy, but in a dictator who valued boldness over caution. It was a devil's bargain that would eventually destroy both Germany and Guderian's reputation. But in 1933, it felt like vindication. The immediate question became rank and authority. Guderian was still only an Oberst, equivalent to a colonel, with no formal command of troops. He had theories, but no army to implement them. The traditional path to advancement in the German military required years of service in conventional roles, commanding infantry battalions or artillery regiments, proving yourself through the established system. Guderian didn't have time for that. He was 45 years old, and he believed the next war was coming soon, that whoever perfected mechanized warfare first would gain an insurmountable advantage. So he leveraged his newfound support from Hitler to leapfrog the traditional hierarchy. By 1935, he had been promoted to general major and given command of the newly formed Second Panzer Division. By 1938, he was general lieutenant and inspector of mobile troops. By 1940, he would be General Oberst, one of the youngest in the Wehrmacht, commanding an entire panzer army. It was a meteoric rise that generated intense resentment among his peers, who saw him as an upstart who had bypassed proper channels and advanced through political connections rather than merit. They weren't entirely wrong, but they also underestimated how much thought and preparation Guderian had invested in his radical vision. the final piece of Guderian's pre-war foundation was intellectual rather than organizational. He spent the late 1930s writing a book called Achtung Panzer, a comprehensive exposition of armored warfare doctrine that became required reading for every German tank officer. In it, he laid out principles that seemed obvious in retrospect, but were revolutionary at the time. Tanks should not be distributed among infantry divisions as support weapons. They should be concentrated in dedicated panzer divisions that could achieve decisive breakthroughs. The goal of tank operations was not to destroy enemy tanks, but to penetrate rear areas and collapse the entire defensive system. Speed and surprise were more valuable than armor or firepower. Communications were just as important as weapons, because coordinated action by many weak units would defeat uncoordinated action by individually stronger forces. And as these ideas drew on Fuller's work, but extended them with practical details about organization, logistics, and tactics, Guderian also made a critical insight that separated him from other tank enthusiasts. He understood that mechanized warfare required not just tanks, but an entire combined arms team moving at the same speed. Infantry had to be motorized to keep up. Artillery had to be self-propelled. Engineers needed armored vehicles to breach obstacles under fire. Supply trucks had to deliver fuel and ammunition to units hundreds of kilometers from their start line. It was a complete reimagining of how armies functioned, and it required technological solutions that didn't fully exist yet. As 1939 approached and war with Poland became inevitable, Guderian commanded a theoretical structure with incomplete tools. He had 3 panzer divisions under his nominal control, organized into what would become Panzer Corps 19, one of the key strike forces for the invasion. But the reality was less impressive than the organizational charts suggested. Many of his tanks were actually Panzer Mark 1s and 2s, lightly armored vehicles with machine guns rather than serious anti-tank weapons, barely more capable than the armored cars he'd demonstrated to Hitler 6 years earlier. Only a fraction of his force consisted of the more capable Panzer Mark 3s and 4s that his doctrine required. Radio sets were in short supply, forcing some units to rely on flag signals or motorcycle couriers. Fuel trucks were requisitioned civilian vehicles that kept breaking down. The grand vision of mechanized warfare was being implemented with whatever equipment could be scraped together from a peacetime economy that was just beginning to mobilize. Guderian drove himself and his subordinates mercilessly in the final months before the invasion, conducting endless exercises, testing supply procedures, trying to iron out the 1,000 details that separated theory from practice. He knew that the world was watching, that if his theories failed in Poland, they would be abandoned forever, and the German army would revert to the traditional doctrines that had failed in the First World War. Everything depended on September 1939, March 14, 1934, a conference room in the Reich War Ministry, Berlin. Heinz Guderian stood before a table covered with technical drawings of a tank that didn't exist yet, arguing with procurement officers who thought his specifications were fantasy. He wanted a medium tank with a 50mm gun, armor thick enough to resist anti-tank rifles, a radio in every vehicle for coordinated operations, and a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour across rough terrain. The procurement officers ran the numbers and informed him that such a vehicle would be too heavy for existing engines, too expensive for mass production, and too complex for the current state of German manufacturing. One engineer tapped his pencil on a schematic and pointed out that adding radios would require redesigning the turret to accommodate both a gunner and a radio operator, both increasing weight and reducing the space available for ammunition. Another noted that achieving 40 kilometers per hour would require a transmission that German factories couldn't yet produce reliably. The meeting was going badly, devolving into a technical argument about what was possible versus what Guderian insisted was necessary. He could feel his vision of mechanized warfare slipping away, compromised by engineering constraints and budget limitations, reduced to building slightly faster versions of the same tanks everyone else had. Guderian tried a different approach. He sketched on a blackboard the concept of tempo in warfare, showing how a tank force that could move 50 kilometers in a day, even with lighter guns and thinner armor, would be more valuable than heavier tanks that could only move 20 kilometers. The key wasn't winning individual tank versus tank duels, it was bypassing enemy strong points entirely, penetrating to command posts and supply depots, collapsing the defensive structure through paralysis rather than attrition. A tank that could communicate by radio could coordinate with dozens of other tanks in real time, concentrating fire on targets of opportunity, responding to threats without waiting for orders to be delivered by runner or motorcycle courier. Speed in communications would multiply combat power more effectively than the thick armor or big guns. The procurement officers listened skeptically. One asked the question that would haunt Guderian for years. What happens when your fast, lightly armored tanks encounter a prepared defensive line with anti-tank guns and artillery? That won't they just be destroyed before they can exploit their speed? Guderian's answer was both brilliant and terrifying. They won't encounter defensive lines because they'll be moving too fast for the enemy to establish them. The whole doctrine assumed success, required success, left no fallback plan for failure. The compromise that emerged over the next 2 years revealed both the genius and the limitations of the early Panzer program. German industry would produce 2 parallel tank models, the Panzer Mark III and Panzer Mark IV, that together would form the backbone of panzer divisions. The Mark III would mount a 37mm gun, inadequate against heavy tanks but sufficient for engaging infantry and light vehicles, and would serve as the primary fighting vehicle. The Mark IV would carry a short-barreled 75mm gun designed for infantry support rather than anti-tank work, providing heavier firepower but with limited anti-armor capability. Both would have radios, but only in command vehicles initially because radio production couldn't keep pace with tank production. Both would aim for 30 to 35 kilometers per hour maximum speed, short of Guderian's goal but acceptable given engineering constraints. The armor would be 30 millimeters thick, enough to stop rifle-caliber bullets and shell fragments, but vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank weapons. It was a halfway solution, better than nothing but not everything Guderian wanted. He accepted it because the alternative was continuing to rely on Panzer Mark I's and II's, which were essentially training vehicles rather than combat weapons. The radio question became the defining technical challenge of Blitzkrieg doctrine. Traditional military communications in the 1930s relied on telephone lines, messengers, and prearranged signals. Telephone lines couldn't move with attacking forces and were vulnerable to artillery fire. Messengers were slow, taking minutes or hours to deliver orders over distances that tanks could cross in the same time. Prearranged signals like flares or flag patterns were rigid, allowing only simple predetermined messages rather than flexible responses to changing situations. Radio offered the possibility of real-time communication across dozens of kilometers, letting a corps commander direct multiple divisions simultaneously, they allowing subordinate commanders to report enemy movements immediately rather than hours later. But radio technology in the early 1930s was bulky, power-hungry, unreliable, and required trained operators who were in short supply. Guderian pushed relentlessly for radio equipment, arguing that uncoordinated tanks were just mobile pillboxes, sitting ducks for enemy artillery, whereas radio-linked tanks could maneuver as a unified organism. The counter-argument from the munitions ministry was brutally pragmatic. Radios added 200 kilograms per vehicle, reduced ammunition storage by 15%, required an additional crew member, and cost as much as a small car. Every radio-equipped tank meant fewer total tanks within the limited production budget. By 1936, Guderian won a partial victory when the Wehrmacht committed to installing radios in approximately 1 tank in 4, with company commanders and above receiving more sophisticated sets capable of longer-range communication. The remaining 75% of tanks would follow visual signals from their platoon and company leaders, who would be listening to radio traffic from battalion and regimental headquarters. It was a hierarchical system that required strict discipline and training, with platoon leaders watching their company commander's tank for signal flags indicating direction and objectives. Company commanders listening to radio orders from battalion commanders coordinating with regimental headquarters. When it worked, it allowed remarkably flexible operations. When communications broke down, individual units could become isolated and confused, operating on outdated information or missing critical changes to the operational plan. Guderian spent enormous energy drilling radio procedures, establishing standardized message formats, training operators until they could encode and decode messages in seconds rather than minutes. He understood that technology alone wasn't enough. It required developing an entire communications culture that didn't exist in traditional military organizations. The armor and firepower compromises haunted the Panzer program from the beginning. French tanks like the Char B1 had 60mm armor and a 75mm gun, theoretically superior to German Panzer IIIs and IVs in direct combat. Soviet T-34s, which would appear later, or would prove even more formidable with 45mm armor and excellent mobility. British Matilda tanks were nearly impervious to German 37mm guns at normal combat ranges. On paper, Germany was building inferior tanks compared to its potential adversaries. Guderian's response was that firepower comparisons missed the point of mechanized warfare. If French tanks stayed tied to infantry formations, moving at walking pace, they would never catch German panzers racing past them at 40 kilometers per hour. If Soviet tanks were dispersed across hundreds of kilometers of front, rather than concentrated for breakthrough operations, superior individual specifications wouldn't matter against coordinated German attacks. The goal wasn't winning tank versus tank duels. It was avoiding them entirely by moving faster than the enemy could react. This doctrine worked brilliantly when it worked, but it required continuous operational success with no room for strategic mistakes or logistical failures. Production numbers told a sobering story about German rearmament in the late 1930s. From 1933 to 1939, German factories produced approximately 1,445 tanks total across all models. By comparison, Germany had hoped to field 5,000 tanks by the start of any major war. The shortfall reflected industrial capacity limitations, raw material constraints, and the complexity of building mechanized vehicles compared to traditional weapons. Each Panzer III required 3 months of factory time, 25 tons of steel, as specialized components like radio sets and optical sights that had to be manufactured separately, and skilled labor that was in short supply as Germany rapidly expanded its military-industrial base. The economic reality was that Germany couldn't outproduce its potential enemies in raw numbers, so it had to outthink them, developing doctrines that made fewer tanks more effective than larger numbers of poorly employed armor. This created enormous pressure on Guderian's theories to perform perfectly because there was no numerical buffer to absorb mistakes. Budget allocation within the Wehrmacht reflected the skepticism that panzer forces still faced from traditional branches. Despite Hitler's enthusiasm for modern military technology, the army budget for mechanized forces from 1933 to 1939 averaged only 18% of total military spending. Infantry divisions, artillery regiments, and support services consumed the bulk of funding, reflecting the conservative bias of senior generals who still viewed infantry as the foundation of military power. Guderian fought continuous bureaucratic battles to secure resources, competing against established branches with deep institutional roots and political connections. Every tank, every truck, every radio set had to be justified against alternative uses of scarce resources. The fact that panzer divisions existed at all by 1939 represented a partial victory, but they remained a minor part of the Wehrmacht's overall structure, an experimental force whose doctrines hadn't been validated in combat. If Poland failed, Guderian knew the skeptics would argue for dismantling panzer divisions and redistributing their equipment to infantry formations. The political dimension of tank development intersected disastrously with military planning during the Blomberg-Fritsch crisis of January 1938. Werner von Blomberg, the war minister, and Werner von Fritsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, both fell from power in a contrived scandal orchestrated by Nazi hardliners who wanted more aggressive military leadership. Their replacements were more compliant with Hitler's plans for territorial expansion, and the crisis created an opportunity for Guderian to advance his agenda with reduced opposition from conservative generals. The new chief of staff, a Wilhelm Keitel, was willing to approve panzer expansion programs that his predecessors had blocked. But the price was deeper involvement with the Nazi regime, tying the development of mechanized warfare to Hitler's strategic ambitions rather than purely military considerations. Guderian found himself navigating an increasingly politicized environment where technical arguments about tank specifications were entangled with ideological questions about Germany's destiny. It was a compromise that would poison everything he achieved. By autumn 1939, with war against Poland imminent, Guderian commanded a hybrid force that represented both breakthrough innovation and uncomfortable compromise. His Panzer Corps 19 had approximately 623 tanks, all of which only 411 were Panzer IIIs and IVs with serious combat capability. The remaining 212 were Panzer Is and IIs, obsolete vehicles retained for training and reconnaissance that would be thrown into combat anyway because there was nothing else available. The organizational structure had been refined through 3 years of intensive exercises, 3 tank platoons, 9 tank companies, battalion and regimental headquarters with sophisticated radio equipment, combined arms teams integrating motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and engineer units. The doctrine emphasized speed, surprise, penetration, and exploitation rather than attrition. The logistics had been calculated and recalculated, fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure, maintenance schedules, casualty estimates. And everything was ready except certainty, because no one really knew if Blitzkrieg would work in practice or collapse into chaos under the stress of actual combat. Guderian was about to find out if 7 years of intellectual development, technical innovation, organizational struggle, and political compromise would translate into battlefield success or humiliating failure. Everything depended on the first hours of the Polish campaign. May 12, 1938. Wehrmacht Headquarters, Berlin. The order-creating Panzer Corps, 1, the first Army-level unit designed entirely around motorized warfare, arrived on staff officers' desks like a puzzle with no instructions. Traditional Army Corps were territorial commands, clusters of divisions assigned to defend or attack specific geographic sectors, with boundaries, rear areas, and communication zones that rarely moved more than a few kilometers per day. Panzer Corps 1 was supposed to operate differently, racing hundreds of kilometers ahead of the main army, bypassing enemy strong points, living off captured supplies when necessary, maintaining cohesion through radio communications rather than fixed geographic positions. The staff officers tasked with organizing this new formation stared at organizational charts that looked nothing like traditional military structures. Where was the Corps rear boundary supposed to be when the leading elements might be 80 kilometers ahead of the trailing units? How did you coordinate artillery support when the front line was moving faster than the guns could displace and set up again? And who was responsible for securing flanks when the entire doctrine emphasized forward momentum rather than consolidation? The questions multiplied faster than anyone could answer them. Guderian's appointment as commander of Panzer Corps 19 in February 1939 gave him authority to implement radical organizational changes that conventional generals would never have attempted. He immediately restructured his command around principles of decentralized execution with centralized intent, a concept borrowed from 19th century Prussian military theory but applied to 20th century technology. Division commanders would receive mission-type orders, specifying objectives and timelines, but not methods, trusting them to employ their forces as they saw fit to achieve results. Battalion and regimental commanders would have extraordinary latitude to exploit opportunities without waiting for permission, breaking with the rigid command hierarchy that had characterized the First World War. The organizational structure flattened the chain of command, reducing the layers between Corps headquarters and frontline tank platoons, accepting that rapid decision-making was more valuable than tight control. It was designed to move at the speed of radio transmission rather than the speed of motorcycle couriers, to make decisions in minutes rather than hours, to reward initiative even when it occasionally produced mistakes. The infamous Guderian Test March of September 1939, conducted across occupied Poland after the main combat operations ended, it became the proof of concept for whether panzer logistics could actually work at the operational scale Guderian envisioned. Over 1,000 tanks moved approximately 200 kilometers in 4 days, a sustained march that tested every assumption about fuel consumption, mechanical reliability, maintenance procedures, and communications. The fuel trucks burned out their clutches trying to keep pace with the tanks. Radio batteries died halfway through, forcing units to navigate by dead reckoning. Tank tracks wore out faster than replacement tracks could be delivered, leaving dozens of vehicles stranded with maintenance crews working through the night. Soldiers slept in their vehicles or on the ground beside them, eating cold rations because field kitchens couldn't keep up with the advance. It was organized chaos, all barely controlled pandemonium, and when it ended, Guderian had a logistical blueprint that showed exactly how far his forces could push before collapsing. He learned that 200 kilometers in 4 days was sustainable, but barely and only if every logistical system functioned perfectly with no enemy interference. Chief of Staff Franz Halder recorded his skepticism about the entire Panzer experiment in a diary entry dated September 15, 1939, after observing Panzer Corps 19 during the Polish campaign. Halder was old guard, a traditionalist who valued methodical planning and systematic execution, deeply suspicious of Guderian's emphasis on improvisation and speed. His notes described the advance as brilliant but fragile, achieving stunning operational results, but constantly on the edge of logistical collapse. He worried that one serious supply failure, one determined enemy counterattack, one mistake in fuel calculations would leave the entire Panzer Corps stranded and vulnerable. Halder represented the conservative majority within the Wehrmacht, who viewed blitzkrieg as high-risk gambling rather than sound military practice. They weren't wrong to worry, but they also underestimated how much Guderian's apparent recklessness was actually calculated risk based on detailed logistical analysis. The tension between these two worldviews, aggressive exploitation versus careful consolidation, would shape German strategy throughout the war. The exact organizational structure of Panzer Corps 19 in September 1939 revealed both the strength and limitations of early panzer forces. The Corps contained 623 tanks divided among 3 divisions, supported by 95,000 personnel in infantry, artillery, engineer, reconnaissance, supply, and support roles. The tank inventory was painfully thin by later standards: 211 Panzer Mark I's with only machine guns, 152 Panzer Mark II's with 20mm cannons, and 260 Panzer Mark III's and IV's with proper anti-tank weapons. Roughly 1/3 of the force consisted of combat-capable tanks by any reasonable definition, 1/3 consisted of light vehicles suitable for reconnaissance and infantry support, but vulnerable in tank combat. And 1/3 were essentially training vehicles pressed into frontline service because there was nothing else available. This mixed composition required tactical flexibility, using light tanks for flanking and reconnaissance while husbanding the more capable mediums for decisive engagements. Supply calculations dominated planning, more than heroic visions of breakthrough operations. A Panzer Mark III consumed approximately 3 liters of fuel per kilometer, traveled under combat conditions, carrying enough internal fuel for about 160 kilometers of operation before requiring resupply. A panzer division with 200 tanks would therefore burn through roughly 600 liters per kilometer of advance, meaning a 50-kilometer advance consumed 30,000 liters of fuel for the tanks alone, not counting trucks, motorcycles, and other vehicles. Guderian's logistics staff calculated that Panzer Corps 19 needed approximately 1,200 tons of supplies per day during active operations, including fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and maintenance equipment. The Wehrmacht's truck fleet could deliver roughly 800 tons per day over distances of 100 kilometers, creating a gap that forced either slower advances or riskier operations with minimal reserves. Every kilometer forward increased the supply line strain, making deep exploitation operations progressively more dangerous as forces moved farther from their supply depots. Communications hierarchy represented the invisible architecture holding the panzer system together. That a corps headquarters would broadcast orders and situation updates on high-frequency radios with 100-kilometer range, reaching all divisional headquarters simultaneously. Division commanders would relay relevant portions to regimental headquarters on medium-frequency sets with 50-kilometer range. Regiments would communicate with battalions using lower-frequency radios with 20-kilometer range. Battalions would coordinate their companies through line-of-sight visual signals supplemented by short-range radio sets. The system worked through redundancy and standardization. If a radio failed, commanders fell back to visual signals, flares, or motorcycle couriers. But radio remained the primary method. Message formats were rigidly standardized to minimize transmission time and reduce errors. A situation report followed a fixed template that could be encoded and transmitted in under 90 seconds. An attack order specified objective, axis of advance, support available, and timeline in a standardized format that any recipient could decode instantly. This communications discipline required constant training because sloppy radio procedures could paralyze an entire corps by clogging frequencies with unnecessary traffic. The contrast between German and French organizational structures illustrated why similar equipment could produce vastly different results. France possessed approximately 4,000 tanks in September 1939, significantly more than Germany's total inventory, with many French tanks superior in armor and firepower to their German counterparts. But French tanks were distributed across the army in small packets attached to infantry divisions, rarely concentrated for massed operations, commanded through a cumbersome hierarchy that required orders to flow up to army level and then back down to individual units. A French division commander who wanted to shift tanks from one sector to another might wait hours or days for approval, whereas a German panzer commander would make that decision in minutes and execute it immediately. French radios were scarce, forcing units to rely on telephone lines and couriers, introducing delays that turned tactical decisions into multi-hour processes. The organizational structure assumed slow, methodical warfare, where careful coordination trumped speed, which made perfect sense in a First World War framework, but proved catastrophic against an enemy who could move 50 kilometers, while French command was still deciding where to commit reserves. Casualty projections versus actual losses during the Polish campaign provided early validation that Panzer Doctrine could work with acceptable costs. German planners estimated that a major offensive operation might lose 15% of attacking forces to enemy action and mechanical breakdown, a rate considered acceptable if it achieved decisive operational results. The actual loss rate in Poland was approximately 8%, lower than predicted, partly because Polish defenses were unprepared for high-speed mechanized warfare, and partly because German tactics of bypassing strongpoints reduced exposure to defensive fire. As this favorable casualty-exchange ratio encouraged confidence that blitzkrieg was viable, though it also created dangerous overconfidence because Poland's military was smaller, less well-equipped, and strategically surrounded compared to potential opponents like France or the Soviet Union. The relatively easy Polish victory masked vulnerabilities that would become apparent later against tougher opposition. As Panzer Corps 19 prepared for future operations through the winter of 1939 and spring of 1940, the organizational structure underwent continuous refinement based on lessons from Poland. Tank maintenance procedures were standardized to reduce repair time. Supply procedures were streamlined to deliver fuel and ammunition more efficiently. And communications protocols were updated to reduce radio traffic congestion. Infantry training emphasized rapid mounting and dismounting from trucks to keep pace with armor. Engineers practiced river crossing procedures until they could erect pontoon bridges in darkness under simulated artillery fire. Every weakness exposed in Poland became the subject of intensive remediation. But the fundamental question remained unanswered. Would these organizational innovations and tactical refinements work against a first-rate opponent with modern equipment, prepared defenses, and competent leadership? Poland had been a testing ground against limited opposition. France would be the real examination, and if Guderian's organizational revolution failed there, if the skeptics within the Wehrmacht would dismantle the entire Panzer experiment and return to conventional doctrine. Everything depended on the spring of 1940, proving that building warfare around speed and communications, rather than firepower and mass, was more than theoretical speculation. It had to work perfectly because there would be no second chance. September 1st, 1939. Dawn, the Polish border town of Piotrków. The first shells from German artillery landed at precisely 4:45 in the morning, shattering windows and sending Polish cavalry horses bolting in panic through empty streets. Heinz Guderian watched from the commander's cupola of his command half-track as the barrage lifted, and the first wave of Panzer Mark IIIs and IVs rolled forward, engines roaring. Now treads churning up the dirt roads at 25 kilometers per hour. Polish defensive positions that had been prepared to resist infantry attacks found themselves overrun by armor before the defenders could properly register what was happening. Machine gun nests that might have held up foot soldiers for hours were bypassed or crushed. Anti-tank guns positioned to cover likely infantry approach routes found themselves flanked by tanks arriving from unexpected directions. Within 90 minutes of the initial barrage, the 3rd Panzer Division had penetrated 8 kilometers into Polish territory, and the speed was only increasing as resistance crumbled. Guderian kept waiting for the counterattack, the moment when Polish reserves would plug the gap and force a grinding battle of attrition. It never came. The myth of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with sabers and lances has persisted in popular imagination for 80 years, a romantic but false image that obscures the reality of what actually happened at Piotrków. Polish cavalry units did encounter German tanks on September 1st, but they were attempting mounted reconnaissance, not suicidal charges. One Polish cavalry brigade, the Wolinska Cavalry Brigade, was caught in the open by German armor near Krojanty and suffered severe casualties when German machine guns opened fire. Italian war correspondents who arrived shortly after the engagement filed sensationalized reports about cavalry charging tanks with medieval weapons, creating a propaganda narrative that both inflated German technological superiority and portrayed Polish forces as hopelessly archaic. The truth was less dramatic but more instructive. Polish cavalry were trained reconnaissance and mobility troops who used horses for transportation, but fought dismounted with rifles and machine guns like any modern light infantry. They were outmatched not because they were using 19th century tactics against 20th century weapons, but because they were dispersed across hundreds of kilometers of frontier with no strategic reserves, facing a concentrated mechanized force that could achieve local superiority wherever it chose to strike. The 3rd Light Division's 200-kilometer advance in 4 days, from September 1st through September 5th, became the proving ground for whether blitzkrieg logistics could sustain operational tempo under combat conditions. The division moved an average of 50 kilometers per day, which doesn't sound extraordinary until you account for resistance, terrain, mechanical breakdowns, fuel stops, and the fog of war. They fought 7 separate engagements with Polish units attempting to establish defensive lines, each time choosing to bypass the strongest positions and strike where resistance was weakest. They crossed 3 major rivers using captured bridges before Polish engineers could destroy them, benefiting from the speed with which German motorcycle troops could reach critical infrastructure before retreat orders arrived. They consumed 1,100 tons of fuel in 4 days against projected requirements of 1,000 tons, a remarkably accurate logistical prediction that gave Guderian confidence the supply system could handle extended operations. But the advance also revealed problems. 40 tanks broke down from mechanical issues unrelated to combat, nearly 7% of the division's strength, requiring recovery vehicles and repair crews to work around the clock. The radios functioned well in open terrain, but struggled in forested areas where hills and trees blocked signals. Infantry struggled to keep pace even in trucks, arriving exhausted at objectives that tanks had seized hours earlier. Guderian's decision to halt at the Vistula River on September 9th and 10th, just as his forces were positioned to encircle Warsaw and potentially capture the Polish government, remains one of the most debated moments of the campaign. Operationally, he could have pushed forward. His tank units had fuel for another 100 kilometers. Polish resistance was fragmenting. And speed had created chaos in the Polish command structure. But politically and strategically, the decision to halt came from higher headquarters concerned about overextension. If Panzer Corps 19 raced to Warsaw while the slower-moving infantry divisions lagged 3 days behind, Guderian's forces would be isolated and vulnerable to Polish counterattacks from the north and south. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized combined arms operations where infantry consolidated ground that armor seized, preventing the pocket from being sealed off. The conservative generals who had never trusted Guderian's theories demanded the halt, arguing that reckless exploitation could turn victory into disaster. Guderian argued vehemently against the order, believing that maintaining momentum would prevent Polish forces from organizing any coherent defense. But he was overruled. Warsaw held out until September 27th, and approximately 60,000 Polish troops escaped encirclement because German forces paused to let the infantry catch up. Tank engagement statistics from the Polish campaign provided the first hard data on how Blitzkrieg performed against prepared defenses. Panzer Corps. 19 entered Poland with 623 tanks operational. By September 27th, 51 tanks had been destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, an 8.2% loss rate over 4 weeks of combat. Of those losses, approximately 60% came from anti-tank guns, 30% from mines and obstacles, and 10% from Polish tanks and armored vehicles. The loss distribution told an important story. German tanks were vulnerable to direct fire from fixed defenses, but largely invulnerable to Polish mobile forces, suggesting that speed successfully reduced exposure to the most dangerous threats. Polish anti-tank guns that might have destroyed dozens of tanks in a slow, methodical advance only got opportunities to fire on a handful of German vehicles before being bypassed or overrun. The speed that Guderian had designed into his doctrine was proving its value in blood and steel. Every kilometer per hour of additional velocity was worth tons of armor plate in reducing casualties. Polish tank inventory at the start of the campaign totaled approximately 475 vehicles, mostly French-designed R-35 light tanks and Polish-built 7TP tanks that were reasonably modern by 1939 standards. The 7TP mounted a 37mm gun and had armor comparable to German Panzer Mark III's, making them formidable in one-on-one engagements. Several German tank crews reported being surprised by the 7TP's effectiveness when they encountered it in prepared defensive positions. But Polish armor doctrine dispersed these tanks across infantry divisions as close support weapons rather than concentrating them for independent operations. Polish tank platoons rarely operated above company level, never achieving the mass and momentum that made German panzer divisions so effective. They fought bravely and sometimes successfully in small unit actions. But they never coalesced into operational level threats because the organizational structure didn't support coordinated armor operations. This was precisely the mistake Guderian had identified in his writings. Tanks employed as infantry support weapons were individually stronger defensive tools, but collectively weaker offensive forces. Fuel consumption data validated Guderian's logistical planning while revealing areas needing improvement. Panzer Corps, 19 consumed approximately 1,200 tons of fuel in the first 4 days of combat, very close to the projected 1,100 tons, suggesting that German staff officers had developed reasonably accurate models for fuel requirements. But the distribution system struggled to deliver fuel to forward units as quickly as operations required. Tank platoons sometimes sat idle for hours waiting for fuel trucks to arrive, precious time when they could have been exploiting breakthroughs. The Wehrmacht solved this temporarily by authorizing forward units to capture Polish fuel stocks, gambling that the speed of advance would seize enemy supplies faster than German logistics could collapse. It worked in Poland because Polish supply depots were overrun before they could be destroyed, but it created a dangerous precedent of assuming captured supplies would compensate for logistical shortfalls. This approach would later prove catastrophic when applied against enemies who practiced more effective scorched earth policies. As Guderian's personal habit of commanding from a radio-equipped half-track near the front lines provided him with real-time situational awareness that was unprecedented for a corps-level commander. In previous wars, generals commanded from headquarters miles behind the fighting, receiving information hours or days old through written reports delivered by courier. Guderian often knew about developments before his own staff officers did, listening to radio traffic between battalion and regimental commanders, occasionally intervening directly to redirect units or authorize tactical changes. This forward command style was risky, exposing him to enemy fire and potentially leaving the corps without leadership if he were killed or captured. But it gave him an intuitive understanding of battlefield tempo that rear area commanders lacked. He could sense when units were approaching culmination points where exhaustion or supply shortages would force a halt, and he learned to read the rhythm of mechanized operations in ways that theoretical study couldn't teach. This intimate connection with frontline reality would serve him well in France, but also create friction with higher headquarters who wanted more formal, predictable command procedures. After-action reports from captured Polish commanders revealed how completely Blitzkrieg had disrupted traditional defensive planning. One Polish general, interviewed on September 27th, explained that his division had prepared defensive positions, assuming they would face conventional infantry assaults preceded by artillery bombardment, giving them time to maneuver reserves and concentrate firepower at threatened points. Instead, 80 German tanks had appeared in his rear areas before his forward observations posts even reported contact, cutting communications lines, overrunning supply dumps, and creating panic in units that suddenly found themselves surrounded without having fought a major engagement. The speed wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was producing psychological paralysis in enemy command structures that couldn't adapt to the compressed decision-making timelines. Polish officers trained in First World War methods where battles unfolded over days or weeks suddenly faced a war where operational situations changed by the hour. Their training hadn't prepared them for this tempo, and their command systems couldn't function at the speeds German operations demanded. The comparison between Army Group North's slower progress using traditional combined arms doctrine and Guderian's speed-focused approach highlighted the effectiveness of mechanized warfare even against relatively weak opposition. Army Group North, advancing through the Baltic Corridor, moved approximately 20 to 30 kilometers per day, consistent with infantry march rates, consolidating positions methodically, ensuring supply lines were secure before advancing further. They suffered lower casualties in percentage terms than Panzer Corps 19 and maintained better control over occupied territory. But they also failed to prevent Polish forces from retreating in good order, allowed enemy command structures to remain functional longer, and gave Polish defenders time to prepare successive defensive lines. And Guderian's approach sacrificed tight control and careful consolidation for speed and shock effect, accepting higher risk of disorganization in exchange for collapsing the enemy's entire defensive structure. The Polish campaign suggested this trade-off was worthwhile, though it remained to be seen whether the same doctrine would work against opponents with better equipment, training, and leadership. As October brought the Polish campaign to a close and Wehrmacht attention shifted westward toward France, the key question was whether the lessons of Poland were real or illusory. Guderian believed he had proven that mechanized warfare could achieve decisive victories with acceptable losses, that speed and communications created disproportionate combat power, that traditional doctrines focusing on firepower and mass were obsolete. The skeptics believed Poland had been a weak opponent poorly prepared for modern war, that France would be entirely different, that Guderian's successes reflected Polish failures rather than German innovations. Both views contained truth, and the answer would come in the spring of 1940, when Panzer Corps 19 faced an enemy with more tanks, better defensive positions, and recent experience fighting Germany in the First World War. If Blitzkrieg failed in France, the entire doctrine would be discredited, and Guderian's career would end in disgrace. If it succeeded, the nature of warfare would change forever. Everything depended on proving that Poland wasn't a fluke, but a preview of military revolution, March 10, 1940. OKW Headquarters, Berlin. The directive assigning Heinz Guderian to command of the Second Panzer Army arrived on his desk with minimal ceremony, a single-page order that represented the largest concentration of mechanized combat power ever assembled under one commander. Guderian sat alone in his office reading the document 3 times, absorbing the magnitude of what he was being given and what was expected in return. 1,500 tanks, 400,000 personnel. Responsibility for the decisive breakthrough that would determine whether Germany could defeat France or face another grinding war of attrition that would drain the Reich's limited resources. The skeptics who had doubted his theories since 1930 were about to get their definitive answer, one way or another. If the Second Panzer Army succeeded, a mechanized warfare would become the foundation of modern military doctrine. If it failed, Guderian personally would bear the blame, and the Wehrmacht would revert to the conservative approaches that had dominated planning before Poland. There was no middle ground, no partial success that would satisfy his superiors or vindicate his ideas. The strategic situation facing Germany in March 1940 was far more daunting than Poland had been 7 months earlier. France possessed a first-rate army with modern equipment, extensive fortifications along the German border through the Maginot Line, and recent combat experience from the First World War that had cost Germany heavily. French tanks were numerous and, in many cases, superior to German models in armor protection and firepower. The British Expeditionary Force, and though smaller than French forces, brought professional training and high morale to the coalition. Belgium and the Netherlands would almost certainly resist German invasion, adding their forces to the Allied total and creating additional defensive lines. Most critically, France and Britain had spent the winter of 1939 and 40 reinforcing their defenses, studying German tactics in Poland, preparing countermeasures to Blitzkrieg Doctrine. They knew what was coming and had months to prepare. Guderian was being asked to lead a decisive breakthrough against an enemy that was ready, willing, and arguably better equipped for the coming battle. Guderian's strategic memorandum of March 20th, proposing a breakthrough in the Ardennes region, nearly got him removed from command before the campaign even began. The Ardennes was a heavily forested, hilly region straddling the Belgian-German border, considered by most military professionals to be impassable for tanks due to narrow roads, steep grades, and limited maneuver space. French planners assumed the Ardennes formed a natural barrier that would channel any German offensive either north through the Belgian plains or south against the Maginot Line, both routes where they had concentrated their best forces. Guderian's proposal to drive the Second Panzer Army straight through the Ardennes towards Sedan was initially dismissed as fantasy. Senior generals pointed out that a panzer army stuck in the forest on narrow roads would be vulnerable to air attack, unable to deploy effectively if it encountered resistance, and logistically stranded if supply trucks couldn't navigate the same roads. The plan seemed to abandon everything that made panzer forces effective: mobility, maneuver space, flexibility. But Guderian argued that this was precisely why it would work. If everyone assumed the Ardennes was impassable, then French defenses there would be weak, creating an opportunity for breakthrough before the enemy could shift reserves. Speed through the forest would be slower than across open ground, but if French forces weren't positioned to stop them, even slow movement would achieve surprise. Hitler's review of campaign plans in April 1940 became the moment when Guderian's strategic vision received authoritative endorsement despite widespread opposition from traditional generals. The dictator listened to competing presentations: von Brauchitz's revision of the old Schlieffen Plan concept, sweeping through Belgium and Holland in a broad offensive; Manstein's sickle-cut proposal, concentrating forces for a narrow breakthrough; and Guderian's refinement emphasizing the Ardennes as the key penetration point. Hitler was drawn to the audacity of Guderian's approach, the promise of decisive victory through surprise and shock rather than grinding attrition. He approved the plan over the protests of conservative generals who wanted more conventional approaches with fallback options if the main thrust failed. Guderian left the meeting with authorization to proceed, but also aware that he had no political margin for error. Hitler's support was conditional on success, and failure would be blamed not on strategic concept, but on tactical execution. He was being given the resources to implement his vision, but also being set up as the scapegoat if anything went wrong. The final resource allocation for the French campaign revealed both the strength and limitations of Germany's mechanized forces in spring 1940. The Second Panzer Army received 1,500 tanks, making it the largest armored formation in the world. But the composition was troubling to anyone who examined the details carefully. Only 60% consisted of Panzer Mark IIIs and IVs with serious combat capability. The remaining 40% were Panzer Mark IIs, light tanks with 20mm cannons adequate for reconnaissance but vulnerable in sustained combat. And a handful of Panzer Mark Is that were essentially training vehicles pressed into service because there was nothing else to fill the ranks. Guderian would be leading a force that looked impressive on paper, but included hundreds of tanks that couldn't realistically fight French heavy armor on equal terms. The plan depended on avoiding tank versus tank combat through maneuver and speed, using superior mobility and tactical flexibility to compensate for inferior firepower and armor in substantial portions of the force. Fuel logistics dominated planning discussions more than tactical concepts or route selection. Germany had accumulated 3.2 million liters of fuel for the French campaign, the largest logistical undertaking in Wehrmacht history to that point, requiring months of stockpiling and transportation to forward depots along the Belgian border. But planners calculated that the Second Panzer Army would consume approximately 200,000 liters per day during active combat operations, meaning the accumulated reserves would support roughly 16 days of sustained offensive action before supplies ran dry. This created enormous pressure to achieve decisive results quickly, before the logistical clock ran out. Guderian's staff developed increasingly sophisticated models trying to balance consumption rates against operational tempo, calculating minimum speeds required to reach objectives before fuel exhaustion forced a halt. Every kilometer gained or lost in daily advances affected whether the campaign would succeed before supplies collapsed. The mathematics were unforgiving. Too slow, and they'd stall short of decisive victory. Too fast, and they'd outrun their supply lines and become stranded. The margin for error was razor thin. Tank composition created tactical headaches that organizational structure tried to solve. Approximately 40% of the Second Panzer Army's strength consisted of Panzer Mark IIs, armed with 20mm cannons that could penetrate perhaps 30mm of armor at close range, barely adequate against French light tanks, and completely ineffective against heavier models like the Char B1. Military critics pointed out that committing such vehicles to combat against first-rate opposition was borderline suicidal, that they would be destroyed in disproportionate numbers by more capable enemy tanks. Guderian's response was that critics misunderstood how mechanized warfare functioned. Panzer Mark IIs wouldn't fight French heavy tanks in frontal engagements. They would reconnoiter, flank, harass, disrupt supply lines, create confusion in rear areas. The heavier Panzer Mark IIIs and IVs would handle serious armored combat when unavoidable. But the doctrine emphasized avoiding such combat entirely through superior operational tempo. Every tank versus tank battle was a failure of maneuver, a regression to static warfare that negated all the advantages of mobile operations. The light tanks' value lay in their numbers and speed, saturating the battlefield with threats that forced enemies to disperse their heavier, more capable units defensively rather than concentrating them offensively. Errant comparative analysis between German and French tank forces revealed a paradox where Germany was numerically and technically inferior but doctrinally superior. France possessed approximately 4,000 tanks total, nearly 3 times German numbers, with many French models superior in individual specifications. The Char B1 had 60mm of frontal armor, a 75mm gun, and excellent mechanical reliability. The Somua S-35 had 40mm armor all around and high mobility. Even French light tanks like the R-35 were adequately armored against German 20mm cannons, but French doctrine distributed these tanks across infantry divisions, rarely concentrating more than a few dozen in any single engagement, embedding them in command structures that required permission from higher headquarters before shifting forces between sectors. German doctrine concentrated 1,500 tanks under unified command, capable of achieving overwhelming local superiority wherever Guderian chose to strike. The organizational asymmetry meant that Germany could mass 300 tanks against 50 French tanks at the decisive point, despite French overall numerical superiority. The question was whether this concentration would work in practice or whether French forces would simply shift their dispersed armor to block the breakthrough once it began. The The specter of what would happen if French heavy armor concentrated against Guderian's spearhead haunted planning sessions through March and April. The German intelligence estimated that if France committed even 500 of its heavy tanks to a coordinated counterattack against the Ardennes breakthrough, they could potentially destroy or trap the Second Panzer Army's leading divisions before the breakthrough could be exploited. A Char B-1 could withstand hits from German Panzer Mark III 37mm guns at all but point-blank range, making frontal engagements heavily favor the French. The German advantage lay in mobility, not firepower, which meant the entire operational concept depended on not getting pinned down in set-piece battles where French material superiority would dominate. Guderian's plan required moving so fast that French armored reserves would always arrive too late, concentrated in the wrong place, and reacting to German movements rather than dictating the battle's terms. It was a high-wire act with no safety net, because if the speed failed to materialize, if the Second Panzer Army got bogged down in combat in the Ardennes forests, the material balance would shift decisively against Germany. As May approached and the campaign start date was set, Guderian conducted final inspections of his forces with growing confidence mixed with persistent doubt. The tanks were mechanically ready, the crews trained, the logistics planned down to individual fuel truck schedules. But the plan required everything working perfectly. Surprise in the Ardennes, rapid breakthrough at Sedan, exploitation westward before French reserves could react, maintaining momentum across 300 kilometers to reach the Channel coast before supply lines collapsed. Then a single significant delay, one determined French counterattack at the wrong moment, one logistics failure, could turn the entire campaign into a disaster that would validate every criticism the conservative generals had leveled against mechanized warfare doctrine. Guderian had spent a decade developing these theories, 7 years implementing them organizationally, but everything depended on 6 weeks of combat in spring 1940, proving that the ideas worked against a first-rate opponent. There would be no excuses if it failed, no claiming that the concept was sound, but the execution flawed. Success or failure would determine not just Guderian's career, but the future of mechanized warfare as a military doctrine. The Second Panzer Army was about to discover whether blitzkrieg was genuine revolution or expensive delusion. May 10th, 1940, 5:35 in the morning, the Belgian border, the lead tanks of Panzer Corps. 19 crossed into Belgium in darkness, headlights extinguished, navigating by moonlight and the glow of burning border posts destroyed by advance reconnaissance teams. Heinz Guderian stood in the cupola of his command half-track, watching the columns stretch behind him into the forest, an endless line of armor and vehicles disappearing into the pre-dawn shadows like a steel serpent sliding through the trees. The Ardennes roads were narrower than expected, forcing tanks to advance in single file, creating traffic jams when the leading vehicles slowed to navigate turns or ford streams. Within 3 hours, the entire spearhead was compressed into a 60-kilometer column, moving at barely 15 kilometers per hour. At half the planned speed, vulnerable to air attack if French reconnaissance discovered them. The radios crackled with reports from divisional commanders requesting permission to bypass slower units, complaints about mechanical breakdowns blocking narrow passages, urgent questions about what to do when encountering Belgian defensive positions. Guderian had imagined a rapid, fluid advance. The reality was organized chaos barely staying functional through training and discipline. French defensive planning had indeed assumed the Ardennes was impassable for armor, a natural obstacle that would channel German forces into predictable avenues where prepared defenses could destroy them. But impassable proved to be an assumption rather than a fact, based on First World War experience with primitive tanks and outdated logistics. Modern panzer divisions with improved engines, better suspension systems, and motorized supply columns could navigate terrain that had defeated earlier attempts. The forests and hills slowed the advance but didn't stop it. Belgian defensive units positioned to defend the Meuse River crossings on the western edge of the Ardennes found themselves bypassed as German armor appeared from the impassable direction they'd assumed was secure. The surprise was working, but at a cost of speed and organization that made Guderian worry whether the entire operational concept would collapse before reaching its objectives. Every hour spent in the forest was an hour for French forces to react, shift reserves, prepare the real defenses that would determine whether the breakthrough succeeded or failed. The combat at Dinant on May 12th and 13th demonstrated both the effectiveness of combined arms integration and the vulnerability of tanks operating without proper support. French cavalry units, mostly motorized reconnaissance elements with light armor, encountered the German spearhead emerging from the Ardennes and immediately engaged. The initial skirmishes favored the French, whose heavier armored cars and better positioning allowed them to destroy several German Panzer Mark IIs before the Germans could deploy effectively. But within hours, Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers appeared overhead, precision bombing French positions with terrifying accuracy, suppressing anti-tank guns and forcing defenders to take cover. German artillery, having finally caught up with the advancing tanks, or began systematic counter-battery fire against French guns. Motorized infantry dismounted and began flanking French positions while tanks provided covering fire. The combined arms approach overwhelmed defenders who had prepared for tank attacks but hadn't anticipated the coordinated employment of air, artillery, armor, and infantry working in tight synchronization. By nightfall on May 13th, the Dinant crossings were in German hands. French forces were retreating westward, and the path to the Meuse River lay open. Guderian's decision to halt and regroup on May 14th at Monthermé, just as momentum was building, revealed the tension between his aggressive instincts and the operational caution demanded by exposed flanks. His leading divisions had penetrated nearly 80 kilometers into Belgium and France in 4 days. All an impressive achievement that also left them dangerously isolated. The slower-moving infantry divisions that were supposed to secure the flanks and protect the corridor were still struggling through the Ardennes, 2 to 3 days behind the armor. French forces to the north and south could potentially cut the corridor, isolating the Panzer spearhead and destroying it piecemeal. OKH, the Army High Command, ordered Guderian to halt until infantry caught up, consolidating the position before resuming the advance. Guderian argued vehemently against the order, pointing out that halting would give French forces time to establish defensive lines and organize counterattacks, negating all the advantages speed had created. But he was overruled. The conservative generals who had never trusted his theories were asserting control, demanding caution over exploitation. Guderian complied with the order, but continued reconnaissance and limited attacks, interpreting his instructions as narrowly as possible to maintain some forward momentum. The crossing of the Meuse River on May 13th became the iconic image of blitzkrieg warfare, the moment when doctrine theory transformed into battlefield reality. French defenders had prepared the river line with artillery, anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and obstacles, expecting weeks of defensive operations if Germany attempted a crossing. German engineers approached under intense artillery fire, casualties mounting as they assembled pontoon bridges under direct observation from French positions. Stuka dive bombers provided continuous air support, screaming down in their characteristic terrifying dives to drop bombs on French artillery positions and suppress defensive fire. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage, creating panic among defenders who had never experienced such concentrated air attack. German infantry crossed in rubber boats while engineers worked frantically to complete vehicle bridges. French artillery fire was accurate and deadly, destroying several bridge sections and killing dozens of engineers, but German replacements immediately stepped forward to continue the work. The crossing that had been planned to take 2 hours actually required 4, double the estimated time, but French counterattacks arrived too late because command delays prevented reserves from moving forward during the critical window. Tank losses during the first 4 days of the French campaign exceeded Polish campaign rates, revealing that blitzkrieg was more costly against first-rate opposition than against weaker enemies. The Second Panzer Army lost 159 tanks from May 10th through May 14th, representing 10.6% of total strength, compared to 8.2% losses over 4 weeks in Poland. The higher attrition rate reflected several factors. French anti-tank guns were more numerous and better positioned. French artillery was more accurate and responsive. Mechanical breakdowns increased due to the demanding Ardennes terrain, and the tempo of operations left less time for field repairs. Any damaged tanks that might have been recovered and returned to service in Poland were abandoned because the advance couldn't pause for recovery operations. Guderian's staff calculated that if losses continued at this rate, the Second Panzer Army would lose 40% of its strength within 3 weeks, potentially culminating before achieving decisive operational results. The mathematics of attrition were working against Germany, creating pressure to achieve breakthrough and exploitation quickly before the tank force eroded below combat effectiveness. Air support from the Luftwaffe proved decisive in offsetting German material disadvantages. From May 10th through May 15th, German aircraft flew 1,550 sorties over the Ardennes corridor, providing continuous air cover, indeed attacking French artillery and defensive positions, and crucially preventing French air reconnaissance from accurately assessing German strength and dispositions. Stuka dive bombers, flying in formations of dozens of aircraft, appeared over key objectives with timing that suggested close coordination with ground forces. The psychological impact of the Stuka's siren, deliberately designed to create terror, demoralized French defenders and disrupted their ability to coordinate defensive fire. But the air support also revealed limitations. German fighters had limited range, forcing them to operate from forward airfields that were sometimes within artillery range of French forces. Weather disruptions on several days severely reduced sortie rates. And the concentration of air power over the narrow Ardennes corridor left other sectors of the front unprotected. The Luftwaffe was burning through fuel and munitions at unsustainable rates, creating its own logistical pressures that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. French defensive preparations revealed both competence and critical weaknesses in Allied planning. The Maginot Line extension north of Sedan existed on planning documents but hadn't been completed when the German offensive began, leaving a gap in prepared fortifications exactly where Guderian's spearhead struck. French reserve tank forces were positioned too far south, concentrated against the expected main German thrust that never came through the Maginot Line proper. Intelligence had detected German concentrations in the Ardennes, but French commanders interpreted them as diversionary forces supporting the real offensive expected farther north. This intelligence failure reflected doctrinal assumptions that blinded French planners to what was actually happening. They saw what they expected to see: German forces deploying in patterns consistent with First World War thinking, and missed the revolutionary nature of concentrated mechanized warfare until it was too late to respond effectively. By the time French High Command realized the Ardennes wasn't a feint but the main effort, German forces had already crossed the Meuse and were beginning the exploitation phase. The Meuse crossing engineering challenges demonstrated how technological problems could threaten even successful operations. And as pontoon bridges capable of supporting 30-ton tanks required specific materials, precise construction techniques, and stable riverbanks. The Meuse at Sedan had steep banks, swift current, and soft-bottom soil that complicated bridge emplacement. Engineers worked under fire to prepare the banks, anchor pontoons against the current, and construct approach ramps that wouldn't collapse under tank weight. French artillery fire destroyed 3 separate bridge sections during construction, each time requiring engineers to rebuild while under continued bombardment. German casualty rates among engineer units approached 15% in a single day, higher than any other combat specialty. But the bridges held, and by late afternoon on May 13th, tanks were crossing the Meuse at 3 separate points, pouring across faster than French forces could react. The engineering success enabled the tactical breakthrough that created operational opportunities. Guderian's fuel situation by May 14th was approaching critical thresholds, despite relatively limited movement. The Second Panzer Army had consumed 1.2 million liters in 4 days, compared to accumulated reserves of 3.2 million liters, leaving 2 million liters remaining. At current consumption rates, this represented approximately 8 more days of sustained operations before fuel exhaustion forced a halt. But the critical phase of exploitation, the race to the Channel coast, would demand even higher consumption as tanks moved at maximum speed across longer distances. Guderian's logistics staff calculated they were on the edge of acceptable margins, with no buffer for unexpected delays or increased resistance. Every liter of fuel became a strategic resource more valuable than ammunition. Supply trucks were running around the clock, drivers so exhausted they were falling asleep at the wheel, accidents blocking narrow Ardennes roads and further complicating logistics. The entire operation was balanced on a knife edge where one major supply failure could halt the advance and give French forces time to organize effective counterattacks. As the Ardennes phase concluded and German forces prepared to break out into open country west of the Meuse, the questions shifted from can they penetrate to can they exploit? The breakthrough had succeeded, achieving surprise, crossing the river barrier, and shattering French defensive coherence in the critical sector. But French armor reserves were beginning to move toward the breakthrough. Allied air forces were increasing sortie rates against German supply lines, and the furthest German advance was still over 200 kilometers from the Channel coast, where strategic encirclement could be completed. The initial success had cost more tanks than planned, consumed more fuel than estimated, and taken more time than hoped. Guderian had proven that blitzkrieg could work against modern defenses, but the decisive test was still ahead. Could the Second Panzer Army sustain high-tempo operations for another week? Would French counterattacks cut the corridor before exploitation was complete? Had the element of surprise been exhausted, or could speed continue to create advantage? And everything that had been achieved in the Ardennes would be meaningless unless the advance could maintain momentum across the 200 kilometers to Abbeville and the sea. The breakthrough was a success, but the campaign's outcome remained undecided. May 17, 1940. Morning, Amiens, France. German tanks rolled through the empty streets of a French city that had been in Allied hands 12 hours earlier, the civilian population still hiding in cellars, French military supplies still stacked in warehouses, breakfast still sitting uneaten on tables in cafes where soldiers had fled at the approach of armor, moving faster than retreat orders could be organized. Heinz Guderian's command half-track paused at a major intersection where his communications officer was setting up a temporary radio post, and he watched his tank column streaming westward without stopping, bypassing Amiens entirely to maintain momentum toward the ultimate objective. The city would be secured by following infantry divisions, but the armor couldn't pause even for a few hours because speed was the entire doctrine. Every minute stationary was a minute for French forces to organize defensive lines ahead, or concentrate armor for counterattacks from the flanks. The advance had to continue until something stopped it, until fuel ran out, or casualties mounted beyond replacement, or French resistance coalesced into something that couldn't be bypassed. So far, nothing had stopped the drive westward except occasional fuel pauses and mechanical breakdowns. But Guderian knew the mathematics of attrition were working against him with every kilometer gained. Its crossing the Somme River on May 17th demonstrated how thoroughly French defensive planning had been disrupted by the speed and direction of the German offensive. French engineers had prepared the Somme bridges for demolition, placing explosive charges and assigning security detachments to destroy them at the approach of enemy forces. But German motorcycle troops reached the bridges before French retreat orders arrived, in several cases capturing them intact when local commanders assumed they had more time before the enemy could possibly reach their positions. The assumption that modern armies moved at predictable speeds, that offensives required days or weeks to advance across major terrain features, proved catastrophically wrong. German forces were covering in hours what French planning assumed would take days, all collapsing time itself as a defensive resource. At Amiens, a critical bridge was captured when German reconnaissance units wearing French uniforms, a ruse that violated the laws of war but proved tactically effective, drove across and neutralized the demolition charges before defenders realized they were enemy forces. By the time French command recognized what had happened, German armor was already streaming across, making destruction impossible without shelling their own positions. The capture of Abbeville on May 20th at 1400 hours represented the strategic culmination of the Ardennes breakthrough, the moment when Guderian's vision of deep penetration and encirclement became reality. German tanks reached the English Channel coast, cutting Allied forces in two, all isolating approximately 300,000 British and French troops in the northern pocket against the Belgian coast. The entire French Northern Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and Belgian forces were now trapped between German forces advancing from the east and the Channel blocking retreat to the west. It was one of the most stunning military victories in history, achieved in just 10 days of operations through terrain that had been considered impassable by armor, against an enemy that possessed numerical and material superiority. Guderian radioed Hitler personally with the report. Second Panzer Army has cut the enemy in two. The message was brief because Guderian was already planning the next phase, turning north toward Dunkirk to complete the encirclement, refusing to pause for celebration when operational opportunities remained to be exploited. The distance covered from May 15th through May 20th redefined what was considered possible in mechanized warfare. Panzer Corps 19 advanced 300 kilometers in 6 days, averaging 50 kilometers per day, sustained over nearly a week of continuous operations. To appreciate how revolutionary this was, cavalry raids in the First World War typically covered 50 to 80 kilometers total before exhausting horses and needing to withdraw. The great cavalry sweeps of the American Civil War rarely exceeded 100 kilometers before horses broke down. Guderian's forces were sustaining cavalry raid speeds day after day after day, not for a short raid, but as part of a campaign-level operation involving hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of vehicles. The logistical achievement was as impressive as the tactical success, keeping fuel and ammunition flowing to units that were often more than 200 kilometers ahead of the nearest supply depot, maintaining coherence across a force spread over enormous distances, coordinating attacks by divisions separated by dozens of kilometers. It required new methods of command and control that simply hadn't existed in previous military operations. Tank availability statistics revealed the cost of sustaining such high operational tempo. The Second Panzer Army began the exploitation phase on May 15th, with 1,400 tanks operational after losses during the Ardennes breakthrough. By May 20th, and only 1,210 tanks remained operational, a 13.6% loss rate in less than a week. The losses weren't primarily combat casualties, but mechanical breakdowns and maintenance failures from pushing vehicles beyond their designed operational limits. Tanks were running 12 to 16 hours per day, crews sleeping in their vehicles during brief fuel stops, maintenance performed only when breakdowns forced halts. Transmissions were failing, tracks were wearing out, engines were overheating, suspension systems were breaking from constant operation over rough terrain at high speeds. German maintenance crews worked around the clock, but couldn't keep pace with the damage accumulating from relentless operations. The tank force was eroding day by day, and Guderian knew that at current attrition rates, he had perhaps another week before the Second Panzer Army fell below combat effectiveness through sheer mechanical exhaustion. Fuel consumption during the exploitation phase reached critical levels that threatened to halt the offensive before strategic objectives were secured. The Second Panzer Army burned through 2.8 million liters of fuel in 6 days, compared to reserves of 2 million liters remaining after the Ardennes phase. Guderian was operating on negative fuel balance, consuming faster than supplies could be delivered. Gambling that captured French fuel stocks would make up the deficit. It worked, barely, because German forces overran French supply depots before they could be evacuated or destroyed, seizing thousands of liters of fuel that kept the advance moving. But this created a dangerous dependency on capturing enemy supplies, a tactical gamble that made the entire operation vulnerable to French scorched earth policies. If French forces had systematically destroyed their fuel stocks during retreat, the German advance would have ground to a halt somewhere between the Meuse and the Channel, stranded in the middle of France with empty tanks. The fact that this didn't happen reflected French command chaos more than German planning excellence. Enemy strength encountered during the dash to Abbeville was substantial on paper, but ineffective in practice due to coordination failures. French and British forces had approximately 1,200 tanks in the northern sector, many of them superior to German models in armor and firepower. But these tanks were scattered across hundreds of kilometers, responding to local threats, never concentrating for coordinated counterattacks that might have cut the German corridor. French Doctrine distributed armor among infantry divisions as support weapons, preventing the kind of mass tank operations that might have challenged German advances. Individual French tank platoons fought bravely and sometimes successfully against German units, destroying dozens of German tanks in small engagements, but they never achieved operational level impact because they weren't organized for mobile operations. British forces attempted several counterattacks with heavy Matilda tanks that German anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate, but these attacks were company or battalion-sized actions that German forces could contain and bypass rather than division-level operations that would have posed serious threats. The comparison between cavalry raid distances in the First World War and Guderian's sustained mechanized advance illustrated the revolutionary nature of what was being accomplished. The deepest cavalry penetration in the First World War, a German cavalry raid in late 1914, covered approximately 80 kilometers before being forced to withdraw. It was considered a significant achievement at the time, demonstrating that mobile forces could briefly penetrate behind enemy lines before inevitable supply exhaustion forced retreat. Guderian's forces were exceeding that distance every 2 days and sustaining it for a week, maintaining combat effectiveness while advancing, resupplying on the move, coordinating complex operations across enormous distances. This wasn't cavalry raid warfare with brief penetration followed by withdrawal. It was sustained operational maneuver that permanently altered the strategic situation. The technological and doctrinal innovations that made this possible represented a genuine revolution in warfare, as significant a change as the introduction of firearms or the shift from horse to mechanized transportation. The communications architecture that enabled coordination across such vast distances operated at the theoretical limits of contemporary radio technology. Guderian's Corps headquarters maintained continuous radio contact with divisional commanders spread across 70 to 100 kilometers, broadcasting operational updates, redirecting units to exploit opportunities, warning of threats, coordinating logistics. But the system was fragile, dependent on maintaining line of sight or specific atmospheric conditions for reliable transmission. Hills, forests, and urban areas degraded radio signals. Atmospheric interference during certain weather conditions rendered communications unreliable. The standardized message formats and communication discipline that Guderian had drilled into his forces became critical because any breakdown in radio procedures would have paralyzed command and control. Several times during the advance, Corps headquarters lost contact with leading divisions for hours, operating blind while those forces continued attacking based on their last known orders. The fact that this decentralized execution worked demonstrated the value of mission-type orders and trained initiative, but it also revealed how close the system was to complete breakdown. As May 20th approached and German forces consolidated their hold on Abbeville, cutting the Allied armies in two, the question became what to do next. The strategic encirclement was complete, but the tactical encirclement remained open. British and French forces in the northern pocket were still organized, still capable of resistance, still holding Dunkirk and other channel ports that could serve as evacuation routes. Guderian wanted to wheel north immediately, attacking toward Dunkirk to close the pocket completely before Allied forces could escape. His tanks had enough fuel for another 40 to 60 kilometers. His crews were exhausted but still functional, and he believed that maintaining momentum for another 2 or 3 days would complete the victory. The British Expeditionary Force would be captured, and French forces in the north would surrender, and the war might effectively end within weeks. But higher headquarters had different ideas, concerns about exposed flanks, fears about overextension, and a desire to consolidate before continuing operations. The orders that came down would lead to one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. May 31st, 1940. The Aisne River, northern France. The celebration after Abbeville lasted less than 48 hours before the Second Panzer Army received new orders redirecting it south toward the remaining French forces that had not been trapped in the northern encirclement. Heinz Guderian stood on the banks of the Aisne River, watching his engineers prepare crossing sites under sporadic French artillery fire, but aware that this second phase of the French campaign would be fundamentally different from the first. The element of surprise was gone. French forces had seen what blitzkrieg looked like and had spent 2 weeks preparing defensive positions along river lines south of the initial German breakthrough. The terrain was less favorable than the Ardennes approach had been, open country where French artillery could engage at long range, fewer opportunities for the kind of rapid maneuver that had characterized the drive to the Channel, and crucially, his tank force was worn down from 3 weeks of continuous operations, mechanical reliability declining, crew exhaustion mounting, supply lines stretched thin. Everything that had worked brilliantly from May 10th through May 20th would now be tested against an enemy that was prepared, dug in, and desperate. Crossing the Aisne River required 2 days of heavy fighting, from May 31st through June 2nd, a dramatically slower pace than the Meuse crossing had been 2 weeks earlier. French defenders had learned from their earlier failures, positioning artillery to cover all likely crossing sites, deploying anti-tank guns with clear fields of fire, coordinating infantry and armor to counterattack any German bridgeheads before they could be expanded. German engineers took heavy casualties building pontoon bridges under sustained artillery bombardment. Several bridge sections were destroyed multiple times, requiring reconstruction under fire. Stuka dive bombers provided air support but with reduced effectiveness because French anti-aircraft defenses had improved, and German air bases were now farther from the front lines, reducing sortie rates. The crossing succeeded eventually through sheer persistence and firepower superiority, but it consumed resources at rates that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Guderian watched his casualty reports with growing concern, seeing losses mount faster than replacements could arrive, tank strength declining, not from dramatic breakthroughs, but from grinding attrition. The drive toward the Loire River from June 10th through 15th represented the final phase of major combat operations in the French campaign, but it felt less like triumphant exploitation and more like exhausted momentum slowly running down. German forces advanced at 60 kilometers per day, faster than the earlier phases, but primarily because French resistance was collapsing rather than because German forces were operating at peak effectiveness. And towns and cities fell with minimal fighting, as French units retreated or surrendered without engaging, but the advance came at a cost that the statistics didn't capture. Tanks were breaking down in increasing numbers, not from combat damage, but from mechanical exhaustion after 5 weeks of continuous operations. Supply trucks were wearing out, forcing logistics officers to requisition civilian vehicles to maintain delivery rates. Crews were so tired that they were making basic mistakes, missing navigation waypoints, failing to maintain proper spacing, accidents and friendly fire incidents increasing as exhaustion degraded performance. The capture of Orleans on June 17th, 250 kilometers south of the initial breakthrough, represented the deepest penetration of the French campaign and revealed the logistical limits of sustained mechanized operations. German tanks had now advanced approximately 400 kilometers from their start lines in the Ardennes, operating at the extreme range of their supply network. Fuel trucks had to drive 800 kilometers round trip to deliver supplies, taking 2 to 3 days per delivery cycle, meaning that fuel arriving at the front had been dispatched from supply depots nearly a week earlier. The system was barely functioning, held together by desperate improvisation and captured French supplies. Guderian's logistics staff warned that they were operating beyond the sustainable limits of contemporary military logistics, that any disruption to the supply network would strand the entire army deep in French territory. But French resistance was evaporating so quickly that the risks seemed acceptable, gambling that the campaign would end before logistics collapsed completely. French armistice negotiations beginning on June 17th created a surreal situation where fighting continued even as the political leadership was surrendering. German forces received orders to maintain offensive operations, to pressure the French government into accepting harsh armistice terms. But everyone knew the war was effectively over. Soldiers fought and died in battles that had no strategic purpose, advancing to seize towns that would be handed over through diplomatic negotiation within days anyway. Guderian's forces continued pushing south toward the Mediterranean coast. It not because military necessity demanded it, but because higher headquarters wanted to demonstrate German dominance. The Second Panzer Army didn't learn about the ceasefire until June 25th, by which point some units were approaching the Swiss border, having traversed the entire length of France in 6 weeks. The anticlimax was jarring, shifting from desperate combat to uncertain peace with no transition period. Soldiers struggling to process that the campaign they'd been fighting had ended days before anyone told them. Tank Strength Evolution, from May 20th through June 25th, told the story of mechanical attrition more clearly than any after-action report. The Second Panzer Army had 1,210 tanks operational on May 20th, after the Abbeville breakthrough. By June 10th, that operational strength had declined to 980 tanks despite minimal combat losses, with the difference representing mechanical breakdowns that couldn't be repaired in the field. By June 25th at the armistice, only 875 tanks remained operational, a cumulative 28% loss rate over the entire campaign. These weren't tanks destroyed in glorious combat, but vehicles that had simply worn out, transmissions failed, engines seized, tracks broken, suspension collapsed from operating beyond design specifications. The tanks that survived the campaign required extensive factory-level maintenance before they would be ready for further operations, effectively removing the Second Panzer Army from combat readiness for months, even in victory. Fuel consumption patterns during the southern phase revealed increasing efficiency as the combat intensity declined. The early phases of the campaign, during the Ardennes breakthrough and the drive to Abbeville, had consumed approximately 3 liters of fuel per kilometer, as tanks maneuvered under fire, changed directions frequently, operated at varied speeds. The southern phase consumed approximately 2.5 liters per kilometer because tanks were moving in sustained advances across open terrain with limited combat, operating more efficiently at steady speeds. But this efficiency was offset by the dramatically longer distances traveled, meaning total fuel consumption actually increased, even as per-kilometer consumption declined. The Wehrmacht's fuel production and stockpiles were stretched to absolute limits, consuming reserves faster than domestic production could replace them. Victory in France came just in time to prevent a fuel crisis that would have paralyzed German military operations for lack of supplies. French reserve divisions committed to the southern defensive lines illustrated the desperation of late-campaign French strategy. By late May, France had only 64 divisions remaining, mostly unmotorized infantry incapable of rapid maneuver, spread across hundreds of kilometers trying to defend against German forces that could concentrate overwhelming strength wherever they chose to attack. French commanders were reduced to guessing where German attacks would come, and hoping they guessed correctly, lacking the mobile reserves to respond effectively once attacks developed. And individual French units fought with courage and sometimes tactical skill, inflicting casualties and delaying German advances. But operational coordination had collapsed. Division commanders had lost contact with corps headquarters. Armies had lost contact with the French High Command, and units were fighting isolated battles without understanding how their actions fit into any larger strategy. It was military disintegration in real time, the complete breakdown of organized resistance that made the German victory appear more decisive than it actually was. Supply line lengths by June 15th, when leading German elements were 400 kilometers from the nearest major supply depot, revealed why operational pauses had been necessary during the campaign. Modern armies couldn't sustain continuous operations indefinitely. There were mathematical limits to how far and how fast forces could advance before logistics required consolidation. The Wehrmacht had reached those limits multiple times during the French campaign, forced to pause not by enemy resistance but by fuel exhaustion, ammunition shortages, or accumulated maintenance requirements. Each pause allowed French forces to retreat and reorganize, reducing the decisiveness of German victories. But the pauses also prevented the kind of catastrophic supply failures that would have stranded German forces deep in enemy territory and turned victory into disaster. The balance between maintaining momentum and avoiding logistical collapse was the central challenge of blitzkrieg warfare, and German commanders were learning through experience where those limits lay. A comparative analysis of German losses against pre-campaign projections suggested that the French victory had been less costly than anticipated, but still significant. German forces suffered approximately 6,892 killed, 3,150 missing, and 14,090 wounded across all branches of service during the French campaign. Pre-campaign estimates had projected 15,000 to 20,000 killed for a successful offensive, so actual casualties came in below projections. But the human cost was still substantial. thousands of families receiving notification that sons or fathers or brothers had died in combat, thousands more dealing with wounded soldiers returning from the front. The relatively favorable casualty exchange ratio, compared to French and British losses, meant that Germany had won a military victory on terms it could afford, but the victory wasn't bloodless or effortless, as propaganda would later claim. As June turned to July and the armistice took effect, the Second Panzer Army found itself scattered across southern France in a state of exhausted triumph. Crews slept for days, physical and mental exhaustion finally catching up after 6 weeks of relentless operations. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, trying to restore vehicles to operational status, but the damage was so extensive that many tanks were stripped for parts to keep others running. Logistics officers calculated that it would take 3 months minimum to rebuild the Second Panzer Army to pre-campaign readiness, all assuming access to factory repair facilities and steady flow of replacement parts. The force that had achieved one of history's most stunning military victories was temporarily non-functional, saved only by the fact that France had surrendered, and there was no immediate threat requiring deployment. But political and military leadership were already planning the next campaign, and the lessons of France about logistics, attrition, and operational limits would soon be tested against an even more formidable opponent in conditions far less favorable than Western Europe had provided. May 24th, 1940, 13:20 hours, OKW Headquarters Directive. The radio message that reached Heinz Guderian's command post was brief and devastating. Panzer units are to halt in place. Infantry will complete the encirclement. One acknowledged receipt. Guderian read the message 3 times, certain there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding in transmission. His forces were within 40 kilometers of Dunkirk, the last major port through which British forces could evacuate, positioned to complete the encirclement of 300,000 Allied troops trapped against the Belgian coast. Another 2 days of advance would close the pocket completely, capturing the entire British expeditionary force and destroying France's best remaining armies in the north. It was the decisive victory that would effectively end the war in the West, delivered on a silver platter to Germany if they simply maintained the momentum for 48 more hours. And now, higher headquarters was ordering him to stop, not to halt the advance and wait for infantry divisions that were days behind to complete the work his tanks could finish in hours. It made no military sense, contradicting everything about operational doctrine that emphasized exploitation and maintaining initiative. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's reasoning for issuing the halt order, communicated through official channels over the following hours, revealed the conservative military thinking that had opposed Blitzkrieg doctrine from the beginning. Rundstedt commanded Army Group A, which included Guderian's Second Panzer Army, and he was deeply concerned about tank losses and vulnerability in urban terrain. His staff had calculated that assaulting Dunkirk would require street fighting, where German armor's advantages in mobility and firepower would be minimized, while its vulnerabilities to close-range anti-tank weapons would be maximized. British and French forces trapped in the pocket were desperate and well-equipped, likely to fight with determination that could inflict severe casualties on attacking German units. Rundstedt believed that preserving the panzer forces for future operations was more important than accepting heavy losses to capture an enemy that was already strategically defeated. Let the infantry conduct the final assault, he reasoned, conserving the mechanized forces that would be needed for subsequent campaigns. It was prudent, cautious thinking that prioritized force preservation over decisive victory. Guderian's response, it's recorded in his personal diary entry for May 24th, captured his frustration and recognition that this decision would have strategic consequences. This order is madness. We should finish them here. The British Army is within our grasp, unable to defend itself effectively, trapped against the coast with no avenue of retreat. 300,000 prisoners and the war in the West ends within a week. Instead, we are told to halt and wait, while the enemy organizes whatever defense they can manage and prepares evacuation. I have protested to Army Group headquarters, but have been told the decision is final and comes from highest authority. We are throwing away a victory that may never come again. The diary entry revealed Guderian's awareness that military decisions weren't purely operational calculations, but often political compromises that sacrificed tactical advantages for strategic caution or ideological considerations he couldn't fully understand from his position in the field. Adolf Hitler's visit to Rundstedt's headquarters on May 24th at 1600 hours sealed the halt order's fate and added a political dimension to what had been primarily a military decision. Hitler approved Rundstedt's recommendation to halt the armor, reportedly expressing concern about the marshy terrain around Dunkirk being unsuitable for tanks and preference for using the Luftwaffe to prevent enemy evacuation rather than risking valuable panzer forces in urban combat. But historians have debated whether other factors influenced Hitler's thinking. Possible desire to facilitate a political settlement with Britain by not completely humiliating their army, concerns about Soviet reactions to overwhelming German victory in the West, or simply acceptance of professional military advice from traditional generals he trusted more than the radical panzer commanders. Whatever the reasoning, Hitler's endorsement meant the decision was irreversible, and Guderian had no choice but to comply, even though he believed it was strategically catastrophic. Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could prevent British evacuation from Dunkirk proved disastrously overconfident and revealed the limits of air power against determined ground operations. Göring, eager to claim glory for the German Air Force and sideline the Army's role, convinced Hitler that continuous bombing would make evacuation impossible, destroying ships in harbor and preventing organized withdrawal. The Luftwaffe flew approximately 1,247 sorties over Dunkirk from May 26th through June 4th, bombing ships, harbor facilities, and troop concentrations. They sank several vessels and inflicted casualties, but they didn't prevent evacuation. British ships operated primarily at night or during poor weather when German aircraft couldn't fly effectively. Smoke from burning oil tanks obscured targets and degraded bombing accuracy. Royal Air Force fighters contested German air superiority, forcing the Luftwaffe to divert resources to air-to-air combat rather than ground attack. The promise of air power preventing evacuation proved hollow, a reminder that air forces couldn't accomplish ground missions regardless of what air advocates claimed. The Dunkirk evacuation's successful completion by June 4th represented one of the great escapes in military history, and validated Guderian's warnings about the halt order. British and French naval vessels, supplemented by civilian boats, ferries, and fishing vessels, evacuated 337,000 troops from Dunkirk's beaches and harbor under constant German air attack. The operation began cautiously, evacuating only 13,000 troops per day initially as organizers learned procedures and coordinated ship movements. But by June 2nd through 4th, the evacuation rate had accelerated to 25,000 troops per day, as experience improved efficiency and desperation increased urgency. Most heavy equipment was abandoned, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces left on the beaches, but the soldiers themselves escaped to fight another day. It was a devastating strategic blow to Germany because those 300,000 troops would form the core of British forces defending against potential invasion and would eventually return to fight in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Guderian's operational assessment, delivered in a formal report to OKH in early June after emotions had cooled, provided detailed analysis of what could have been achieved if the halt order hadn't been issued. He estimated that the Second Panzer Army could have reached Dunkirk within 48 hours of May 24th, completing the encirclement before British evacuation operations were fully organized. Tank strength was sufficient, fuel reserves adequate for a 40-kilometer advance, and French defensive positions between German forces and Dunkirk were minimal. Estimated losses from urban combat were projected at 15 to 20% of attacking forces, significant but acceptable for capturing 300,000 enemy troops. The window of opportunity had been real, not a post-facto fantasy invented to shift blame, but Guderian also acknowledged that urban combat would have been costly and risky, that Rundstedt's concerns about vulnerability in street fighting had some validity, and that the halt order represented a legitimate strategic choice even if he believed it was the wrong choice. Military history was full of commanders second-guessing decisions with perfect hindsight, and Guderian tried to avoid that trap, even as he defended his position. The comparative analysis between Guderian's tank strength and likely casualties in urban warfare revealed why the halt order debate involved genuine strategic trade-offs rather than obvious right answers. Guderian commanded approximately 1,000 operational tanks on May 24th, concentrated in divisions experienced in mobile warfare but not trained specifically for urban combat. Dunkirk was a mid-sized port city with narrow streets, multi-story buildings providing defensive positions, and desperate enemy forces with nothing to lose by fighting to the last. Historical examples of urban combat suggested attacker casualties of 15 to 20% were realistic, meaning Guderian might have lost 150 to 200 tanks capturing the city. Those losses would have significantly degraded Second Panzer Army readiness for subsequent operations, potentially requiring months of rebuilding and replacement. From Rundstedt's perspective, trading 200 tanks for 300,000 prisoners was questionable when the prisoners were already strategically neutralized by encirclement. From Guderian's perspective, those prisoners would fight again if allowed to escape, making their capture worth significant losses. Both arguments had merit, which was why the debate persisted for decades after the war. The long-term consequences of the Dunkirk halt order extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in May 1940. The 300,000 British and French troops who escaped formed the foundation of Allied resistance to Germany for the next 5 years. British military planners who might have considered negotiated peace after France fell instead recognized that their army had survived intact and could continue fighting. Winston Churchill's famous "We shall fight on the beaches" speech gained credibility because Britain actually had an army capable of defending those beaches. The French forces that evacuated contributed to free French units that fought throughout the war. Most critically, the escape convinced Hitler that Britain might be willing to negotiate rather than fight to destruction, encouraging him to postpone invasion plans in favor of diplomatic overtures that never succeeded. If those 300,000 troops had been captured in May 1940, the entire strategic situation might have developed differently, potentially leading to British surrender, earlier attack on the Soviet Union, or fundamentally altered course of the war. Guderian's claim in post-war memoirs that "we lost the war here at Dunkirk" was controversial, but contained important truth about how small decisions at operational level could have strategic consequences. He wasn't claiming that capturing the British Expeditionary Force would have guaranteed German victory in the Second World War, but he argued that it would have created conditions far more favorable for Germany than what actually developed. And Britain without an army might have negotiated peace. Germany could have concentrated entirely on the Soviet Union without Western Front concerns. Resources devoted to defending against British attacks could have been allocated elsewhere. The counterfactual speculation was endless, but the core point was valid. Operational decisions made by field commanders and their superiors could alter the course of history in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The halt order on May 24, 1940, was such a decision, made for understandable reasons by competent commanders, that nonetheless contributed to Germany's ultimate defeat by allowing an enemy army to escape and continue fighting when it could have been destroyed. June 28, 1940. Paris. Morning. Adolf Hitler toured the conquered French capital in an open car, stopping at the Eiffel Tower, Napoleon's tomb, and the Opera House like a tourist visiting monuments he'd only seen in photographs. Heinz Guderian stood in the background of the official photographs, uncomfortable with the triumphal celebration that felt premature given the Second Panzer Army's actual condition. While propaganda cameras captured images of German dominance, Guderian's staff was compiling sobering statistics about tank losses, mechanical breakdowns, and maintenance requirements that told a very different story than the victory narrative being constructed for public consumption. 40% of his tanks needed major repairs that couldn't be accomplished in field workshops. Crews were exhausted, equipment worn to breaking points, supply stocks depleted. The stunning victory in France had been achieved, but at costs that weren't sustainable if Germany faced another campaign of similar intensity. Yet no one at the highest levels of command seemed interested in discussing these uncomfortable realities, while they were busy celebrating triumph. Guderian's post-campaign analysis, submitted to Wehrmacht leadership in July 1940, warned explicitly about sustainability problems that the French victory had obscured. He documented that average tank loss rates during the campaign were 3.2% per month from all causes including combat, mechanical breakdown, and accidents. Replacing these losses required manufacturing 85 new tanks per month just to maintain current strength levels, not counting expansion or modernization. And German industry was producing approximately 140 tanks per month total across all models, which sounded adequate until you realized that number had to supply the entire Wehrmacht, not just the Second Panzer Army. Every other panzer division, every reserve unit, every training formation was competing for the same limited production. The mathematics suggested that Germany could sustain one French-style campaign per year before tank strength began declining from attrition faster than replacement, and that assumed no increases in enemy capabilities or defensive effectiveness. Wehrmacht logistics reports compiled in August 1940 revealed the scale of damage that 6 weeks of combat had inflicted on Germany's mechanized forces. The Second Panzer Army lost 400 tanks during the French campaign, 28% of starting strength, with losses almost evenly split between combat damage and mechanical breakdown. The combat losses were expected and accepted as the cost of victory. The mechanical losses represented a more insidious problem: the accumulated wear from operating vehicles beyond design specifications. Of the 400 lost tanks, approximately 45% were total losses that couldn't be recovered or repaired. The remaining 55% were theoretically repairable, but required factory-level maintenance that would take months. Only 60% of damaged tanks were actually recoverable from French battlefields. The other 40% had been abandoned during the rapid advance, stripped for parts, or left in enemy territory. These statistics suggested that sustained high-tempo operations were incompatible with maintaining tank strength over time. German tank production capacity in 1940, producing 125 tanks per month on average, was completely inadequate for the kind of mechanized warfare the French campaign had demonstrated was possible. The Wehrmacht was losing tanks across all its formations at a rate of approximately 140 tanks per month, creating a 15-tank monthly deficit, before accounting for any expansion of forces or modernization of equipment. This deficit was small enough to ignore in the short term, especially given the successful outcome in France, but it represented a fundamental sustainability problem. Germany was consuming its tank force faster than industry could replace it, which meant that every campaign eroded combat power that couldn't be fully restored before the next campaign began. The French victory had been achieved with inadequate production infrastructure supporting it, and unless production expanded dramatically, future campaigns would be fought with progressively weaker forces. Comparative data on tank production between Germany and potential enemies revealed a sobering strategic reality that contradicted the triumphalism following France's defeat. British factories produced approximately 1,400 tanks in 1940, 10 times Germany's monthly rate. French production before the armistice had been running at 300 tanks per year, lower than Germany but still significant. Soviet production, largely unknown to German intelligence at the time, was approximately 2,800 tanks in 1940, more than 20 times German production. The United States, not yet in the war, had minimal tank production, but possessed industrial capacity that could eclipse all other nations combined if mobilized. Germany's advantage wasn't production capacity. It was doctrine, training, and operational employment. But doctrine couldn't compensate indefinitely for numerical inferiority, especially against enemies who were learning from defeat and improving their own doctrines. Officer casualties during the French campaign, while relatively light in percentage terms, disproportionately affected experienced leadership that couldn't easily be replaced. The Second Panzer Army lost 312 officers killed, approximately 1% of total officer strength, which seemed acceptable until examining the specific losses. 47 tank commanders and advanced grade leadership were killed, representing the most experienced and tactically proficient officers, men who understood mechanized warfare at operational level through combat experience rather than theoretical study. Training new tank commanders took months. Developing officers capable of leading battalion or regimental level operations took years. The institutional knowledge lost when a veteran major or lieutenant colonel died couldn't be recovered by promoting a less experienced captain or lieutenant, regardless of individual talent. These losses degraded the Second Panzer Army's combat effectiveness in ways that casualty statistics alone couldn't capture. Repair facility limitations became apparent as the scale of required maintenance exceeded available capacity. Germany had established repair depots and factory facilities designed to handle peacetime maintenance loads and modest combat damage from limited conflicts. The French campaign generated repair requirements that overwhelmed these facilities, with hundreds of tanks requiring transmission replacements, engine overhauls, track installation, suspension repairs, and general refurbishment. Bottlenecks developed where specialized parts or skilled technicians were in short supply. Some tanks sat for weeks waiting for components that hadn't been manufactured yet. Others were cannibalized to provide parts for vehicles deemed higher priority for restoration. The Wehrmacht discovered that industrial mobilization for war required more than building new weapons. It required building the maintenance infrastructure to keep those weapons functional through extended campaigns. Hitler's strategic planning meetings in August 1940 revealed dangerous overconfidence based on the French victory's apparent decisiveness. The dictator dismissed concerns about Soviet rearmament, confident that German military superiority demonstrated in France would translate to any theater. He ignored warnings from intelligence services about British production increases and American industrial potential. He interpreted the quick victory in France as validation that Germany could handle any military challenge through superior doctrine and leadership, not recognizing that France's defeat reflected specific French weaknesses as much as German strengths. This overconfidence would lead to strategic decisions in the following year that committed Germany to operations beyond its sustainable capacity, gambling that quick victories could be achieved before resource limitations became critical. The illusion of invincibility created in summer 1940 blinded leadership to fundamental constraints that would eventually doom the entire war effort. British intelligence agencies studying the French campaign drew very different conclusions than German leadership about what had actually happened. British analysts recognized that German success resulted from concentrated mechanized forces exploiting French organizational and doctrinal failures, not from overwhelming material superiority. Now, they noted that German tanks were often inferior to French models in specifications, but superior in employment. They observed that Luftwaffe air support was crucial to success, but depended on short distances and favorable weather that might not exist in other theaters. They documented German logistic struggles and recognized that extended supply lines or harsher climates would exacerbate these problems. British military reform efforts beginning in summer 1940 focused on developing their own mechanized capabilities, improving coordination between arms, and avoiding the dispersed defensive deployments that had doomed France. The lessons Germany's enemies learned from the French campaign would make subsequent German victories progressively more difficult. And as summer 1940 transitioned to autumn and planning began for future operations, the fundamental question facing the Second Panzer Army was whether the French model could be repeated or whether it represented a unique circumstance unlikely to recur. France had been geographically compact, allowing short supply lines. The terrain had been suitable for armor, except in the Ardennes, where surprise compensated for difficult ground. French forces had been poorly prepared doctrinally, despite numerical and material advantages. The campaign had lasted only 6 weeks, within the time frame that German logistics could sustain. Weather had been favorable, allowing continuous air support. Would these favorable conditions exist in future campaigns? The Soviet Union presented radically different challenges: vast distances, extreme climates, all an enemy with its own mechanized forces and recent combat experience. If Blitzkrieg doctrine was tested in conditions less favorable than France, would it still work, or would fundamental limitations become apparent that the French victory had hidden? Guderian and his staff worried about these questions even as propaganda celebrated their triumph, understanding that France had validated some aspects of mechanized warfare doctrine while leaving others untested and uncertain. October 12, 1940. OKW Briefing Room, Berlin. The intelligence summary on Soviet military strength lay open on the conference table like an indictment of Germany's entire strategic approach. Estimated 10,000 Soviet tanks versus German forces of approximately 2,500 tanks total. Heinz Guderian studied the numbers with growing unease. Now, recognizing that the mathematics of mechanized warfare that had worked so brilliantly in France would look very different against an enemy with 4-to-1 numerical superiority in armor, the briefing officer continued presenting estimates of Soviet production capacity, force dispositions, defensive preparations, each data point suggesting that Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, would be fundamentally different from previous campaigns. This wasn't Poland with limited forces and backward doctrine. This wasn't France with superior equipment, but poor organization. This was an enemy that had been building mechanized forces for over a decade, that possessed industrial capacity Germany couldn't match, that controlled territory so vast that logistical calculations became almost meaningless. Guderian listened and wondered whether anyone at OKW truly understood what they were proposing. Adolf Hitler's directive, 21, issued on December 18, 1940, codified the decision to invade the Soviet Union and assigned Guderian command of the Second Panzer Army for the campaign. The directive outlined ambitious objectives: destroy Soviet forces in Western Russia through rapid encirclement operations, advance to a line from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan, occupy key industrial regions, and eliminate the Soviet Union as a military power within a single campaign season. The timeline assumed operations would begin in May 1941 and conclude by autumn, before Russian winter weather made sustained operations impossible. Reading the directive, Guderian was struck by how much it resembled the French campaign plan: rapid breakthrough, deep penetration, encirclement of enemy forces, exploitation before defenders could organize coherent resistance. The doctrine was the same, but the scale was orders of magnitude larger. France had been 400 kilometers deep from border to Paris. Moscow was over 1,000 kilometers from the German start lines. Could blitzkrieg logistics sustain themselves over such distances? Guderian's inspection tour of the Soviet frontier in March 1941 provided concrete details that transformed abstract planning into operational reality. He drove along the border with Poland, examining terrain, measuring distances, assessing road quality, calculating fuel requirements. The distance to Moscow was approximately 1,050 kilometers from likely start positions, more than twice the distance of the entire French campaign. The roads were unpaved in many areas, dirt tracks that would turn to mud during spring rains or autumn weather. Soviet forces had been building defensive positions for months, learning from German successes in the West, and preparing countermeasures. The scale was overwhelming, requiring coordination across thousands of kilometers of front, maintaining supply lines longer than any mechanized force had ever attempted, sustaining operations through climate extremes that would test equipment beyond design specifications. Guderian submitted his assessment to OKH, highlighting these challenges, and only to be told that superior German training and doctrine would compensate for logistical difficulties. Production planning meetings in March 1941 revealed fundamental disconnects between operational requirements and industrial capacity. Wehrmacht logistics staff calculated that reaching Moscow and sustaining operations there would require approximately 2.4 million tons of supplies delivered across 1,000 kilometers of extended supply lines. German transportation capacity, using available trucks and rail infrastructure, could deliver approximately 1.8 million tons, a deficit of 600,000 tons that would have to be made up somehow. The assumption was that captured Soviet supplies would fill the gap, and that German forces would advance so rapidly they would seize enemy stockpiles before they could be evacuated or destroyed. This was the same assumption that had worked in France, where captured fuel and ammunition had supplemented German logistics. But it represented a dangerous dependency on success, a circular logic where the campaign had to succeed quickly because logistics couldn't sustain extended operations. But sustaining rapid operations required capturing enemy supplies that might not exist or might be destroyed before capture. Soviet tank inventory estimates in June 1941 ranged from conservative to alarming, depending on intelligence sources. The official OKW estimate was 23,000 Soviet tanks total, a number so large that many German officers dismissed it as propaganda exaggeration. And surely no military could possess that many armored vehicles. The logistics and maintenance alone would be impossible. But the number was actually conservative. Soviet production had been ramping up for years, prioritizing quantity over quality in many cases, building thousands of tanks that might have individual weaknesses but collectively represented overwhelming force. German intelligence correctly identified that many Soviet tanks were obsolete models, T-26s and BT series light tanks that were inferior to German Panzer IIIs and IVs. But intelligence also noted small numbers of a new Soviet heavy tank called the KV-1 and a medium tank designated T-34, both of which had concerning specifications that suggested they might be superior to German vehicles in some respects. A German tank inventory for Operation Barbarossa totaled 3,338 tanks across all types, organized into 19 panzer divisions plus independent battalions. The composition revealed both improvements from the French campaign and persistent weaknesses. 408 Panzer Mark I's remained in service despite being essentially obsolete, kept in inventory because nothing else was available to replace them. 746 Panzer Mark II's provided reconnaissance and screening capabilities, but were vulnerable in sustained combat. 1,436 Panzer Mark III's represented the backbone of German armor, equipped with 50mm guns that were adequate against most opponents but struggled against heavy armor. And 665 Panzer Mark IV's provided close support with 75mm guns. 83 other vehicles included command tanks, recovery vehicles, and specialized equipment. It was a larger force than Germany had fielded in France, but facing an enemy with 6 to 7 times as many tanks meant that numerical superiority would favor the Soviets in any sustained campaign. The logistics calculation for reaching Moscow revealed why many professional officers considered Barbarossa strategically unsound. Each panzer division required approximately 150 tons of supplies per day, including fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and maintenance equipment. The Second Panzer Army, consisting of multiple panzer and motorized divisions, needed roughly 1,200 to 1,500 tons daily. Reaching Moscow would require 30 to 40 days of sustained operations, assuming 25 to 35 kilometers per day average advance. Total supply requirement would therefore be approximately 45,000 to 60,000 tons, delivered across progressively extending supply lines. German logistics capacity could support this, barely, if everything worked perfectly. No major battles consuming excess ammunition, no fuel losses to enemy action, no mechanical breakdowns requiring additional spare parts, no delays from weather or terrain. The margin for error was non-existent, and the plan assumed a level of logistical perfection that had never been achieved in military history. Intelligence estimates of Soviet tank production proved to be catastrophically wrong, underestimating actual capacity by over 80%. German intelligence assessed Soviet production at approximately 500 tanks per month, based on known factory capacity and production rates from the late 1930s. Actual Soviet production in 1941 was approximately 2,400 tanks per month, nearly 5 times the German estimate. This meant that even if German forces destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks, which they would, Soviet industry could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The strategic implication was devastating. Blitzkrieg doctrine was designed for campaigns where quick victories disrupted enemy production and prevented reinforcement. Against an enemy who could replace losses faster than they were inflicted, rapid victory became essential because extended campaigns would favor the side with greater industrial capacity. Yet Germany had to win quickly or not at all, and the logistics suggested that quick victory might not be achievable across Soviet distances. The comparison between France campaign distances and Soviet campaign distances illustrated why Barbarossa represented a qualitatively different challenge. The French campaign maximum supply line was approximately 400 kilometers from German depots to the furthest advance at the Channel coast. Soviet operations would require sustaining supply lines over 1,000 kilometers to reach Moscow, and possibly 1,500 kilometers if operations extended to the Volga River, as some planning documents suggested. Every kilometer of supply line required trucks to transport materiel, fuel to power those trucks, security forces to protect convoys from partisan attack, maintenance facilities to repair vehicles, and time for round-trip delivery cycles. The French campaign had pushed German logistics to its limits at 400 kilometers. Soviet operations would require sustaining lines 2.5 times longer through more difficult terrain against a more capable enemy. The historical precedent suggested it was impossible, but Hitler and OKW insisted it was necessary. As planning for Barbarossa continued through winter and spring of 1941, Guderian found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He understood mechanized warfare better than almost any commander alive. He had practical experience implementing blitzkrieg doctrine in combat, and he could see the operational and logistical problems that made Barbarossa extraordinarily risky. But he was also a German general in a totalitarian state where dissent from strategic decisions made by the Führer could cost careers or worse. Other officers who had expressed reservations about Barbarossa had been removed from command or sidelined. Guderian made his concerns known through official channels, documenting the logistics challenges and numerical disadvantages, but he didn't refuse the assignment or resign in protest. He rationalized that professional soldiers implemented political decisions regardless of personal opinions, that his duty was to execute operations as effectively as possible rather than question strategic wisdom. It was a compromise that would haunt him later. The recognition that he participated in a campaign he knew was probably unsustainable because refusing would have accomplished nothing except removing him from command and replacing him with someone less competent. The Second Panzer Army prepared for operations in the east, with growing doubt concealed beneath professional competence. June 22, 1941, 03:15 hours, the Soviet border. The artillery barrage began in darkness, 3,000 guns firing simultaneously across a 1,000-kilometer front, shells arcing towards Soviet positions that had been peaceful 30 seconds earlier. Heinz Guderian's Second Panzer Army, now commanding 1,800 tanks, crossed into Soviet territory against the 11th Army's defensive positions, all encountering initial resistance that evaporated almost immediately under the assault's intensity. Soviet units had been caught completely by surprise despite intelligence warnings that German forces were massing on the border, orders not to provoke Germany having prevented full defensive preparations. Within hours, the leading German panzer divisions had penetrated 20 to 30 kilometers, overrunning Soviet defensive positions, capturing confused prisoners who didn't understand they were at war. It felt eerily similar to Poland and France, the same pattern of surprise, rapid advance, enemy confusion. But Guderian knew the similarities were superficial. All that Soviet strategic depth meant these initial successes were meaningless unless they translated into sustained operational victories before distances and logistics overwhelmed German capabilities. The Minsk Encirclement from June 27th through 29th demonstrated that blitzkrieg could work against Soviet forces, but also revealed disturbing differences from previous campaigns. German panzer units completed a classic double envelopment, surrounding 328,000 Soviet troops in a massive pocket near Minsk, cutting them off from supply and reinforcement. The operation was textbook perfection, validating Guderian's doctrine about speed and penetration, creating paralyzing effects on enemy command structures. But the encircled Soviet forces didn't surrender quickly like Polish or French units had. They fought with desperate determination, attempting breakouts, conducting costly counterattacks, holding out for weeks in some cases rather than days. German infantry divisions tasked with reducing the pocket took heavy casualties destroying enemy formations that refused to quit even when surrounded. The encirclement succeeded, but it consumed time and resources that the campaign timeline couldn't afford. Every day spent destroying pockets was a day not spent advancing toward Moscow. The Battle of Smolensk from July 10th through September 10th revealed that Soviet defensive capabilities were fundamentally different from what German planning had assumed. Previous campaigns had featured penetration, encirclement, and exploitation in a matter of days or weeks. Smolensk turned into a 2-month grinding battle, where German forces encircled 260,000 Soviet troops, but couldn't quickly destroy them. Soviet forces inside the pocket conducted determined resistance, tying down German infantry and consuming ammunition at rates that strained supply networks. Soviet forces outside the pocket launched continuous counterattacks trying to break the encirclement, forcing German commanders to allocate panzer units defensively rather than for exploitation. The battle duration extended from 6 days, which was typical for French campaign encirclements, to 60 days, a tenfold increase that suggested the campaign timeline was already failing. Guderian submitted situation reports to Hitler, claiming victory and citing 2.2 million Soviet casualties. But privately acknowledged that his tank losses were running 40% higher than predicted, and the advance toward Moscow was falling behind schedule. Tank losses during the first month of Barbarossa, June through July 1941, exceeded anything the Second Panzer Army had experienced in previous campaigns. 400 tanks were lost in just the first month, compared to 280 total losses in the entire 6-week French campaign. The loss rate was approximately 22% monthly, more than 6 times the sustainable rate that Guderian's post-France analysis had identified. Combat losses were higher than expected, because Soviet anti-tank weapons were more numerous and better employed than French equivalents had been. And mechanical breakdown rates were significantly higher because Soviet roads degraded vehicles faster than Western European infrastructure had. Recovery of damaged tanks was more difficult because the distances were greater, and Soviet partisan activity made rear areas less secure. At this loss rate, the Second Panzer Army would be combat ineffective within 4 to 5 months, even if Soviet forces did nothing except trade space for German casualties. The mathematics of attrition were working decisively against Germany. Fuel consumption in Soviet operations dramatically exceeded planning assumptions, revealing how terrain and climate affected mechanized warfare performance. German tanks consumed approximately 4.2 liters of fuel per kilometer in Soviet operations, compared to 2.5 liters per kilometer in France. The difference reflected several factors. Soviet roads were worse, requiring lower gears and more power to traverse. Summer temperatures were hotter, increasing engine stress. Constant combat meant frequent speed changes and maneuvering rather than sustained highway driving. Tactical situations require more idling and positional adjustments. This 68% increase in consumption per kilometer meant that fuel lasted barely more than half as long as planning had assumed. Tanks that should have had 160-kilometer operational range were running dry after 90 to 100 kilometers. Supply trucks were consuming more fuel delivering supplies because of longer distances and worse roads. The entire fuel budget for the campaign was being exhausted faster than anticipated, with the advance not even halfway to Moscow. Now, Soviet tank quality shocked German commanders when they first encountered T-34 and KV-1 models in combat. The T-34 mounted an excellent 76mm gun and had 45mm of sloped armor that provided effective protection equivalent to 60 to 70mm of vertical plate. It could reach 54 kilometers per hour, faster than most German tanks, and had wide tracks that provided superior mobility in mud and snow. German Panzer Mark IIIs struggled to penetrate T-34 armor at normal combat ranges, finding that their 50mm guns were inadequate against this Soviet design. The KV-1 heavy tank was even more formidable with 90mm of frontal armor that was nearly impervious to German tank guns, all requiring 88mm anti-aircraft guns to be brought forward for anti-tank work. These vehicles appeared in small numbers initially, suggesting they were new designs just entering production, but their presence was deeply troubling. If Soviet industry could produce these tanks in quantity, German armor would be outmatched in specifications as well as numbers. Soviet losses during the first month were indeed catastrophic, validating German tactical approaches even while strategic problems were developing. Soviet forces lost approximately 2,200 tanks in June and July 1941, destroyed or captured in the initial onslaught that their defensive preparations couldn't contain. Command and control broke down across entire armies. Communications were severed. Units were encircled and destroyed before they could organize effective resistance. But Soviet production replaced these losses in approximately 3.5 weeks, meaning that by early August, Soviet tank strength was nearly back to pre-invasion levels despite losing thousands of vehicles. This was the nightmare scenario that German intelligence had underestimated, an enemy that could absorb losses that would cripple other nations and continue fighting because industrial capacity could replace material faster than combat could destroy it. Germany was winning every battle, but potentially losing the strategic competition because Soviet resources were deeper than German forces could exhaust. The comparison of encirclement timescales between France and the Soviet Union illustrated how operational tempo was degrading. In France, all major encirclements from penetration to complete destruction took approximately 6 days. Polish pockets had been reduced in similar time frames, but Smolensk required 60 days from initial encirclement to final reduction, and Soviet forces inside the pocket fought so effectively that German casualties were substantial. The difference reflected several factors. Soviet units were more numerous, requiring more German forces to contain them. Soviet doctrine emphasized counterattack, even from encirclement, forcing Germans to fight defensively. Soviet communications sometimes remained functional in pockets, allowing coordination of breakout attempts, and Soviet troops fought with determination that surprised German commanders expecting quick surrender once encircled. The slower pace meant that panzer forces were tied down, securing pockets rather than exploiting forward, reducing the operational tempo that was essential to blitzkrieg success. Guderian's first recognition that the Soviets weren't going to collapse like France came sometime in late July or early August, though he never documented the exact moment in his diary. The pattern was becoming clear. German tactical victories were consistent and impressive. Soviet units were being destroyed in massive numbers. Territory was being seized, but the enemy kept fighting. New Soviet divisions appeared from the interior, replacing units that had been destroyed. Defensive lines formed faster than German advances could overcome them. Counterattacks came from sectors where German intelligence thought Soviet forces were exhausted. The assumption that Soviet morale would crack under sustained pressure, that the communist system would collapse when tested by modern warfare, that rapid victories would produce strategic paralysis, all of these proved wrong. The Soviet Union was absorbing punishment that would have destroyed France or Poland and continuing to fight. Guderian began to understand that Germany had committed to a campaign without a clear path to victory, gambling that operational excellence could overcome strategic impossibility. As summer 1941 progressed and the Second Panzer Army pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the numerical disadvantage became impossible to ignore. German intelligence estimated Soviet tank strength at the war's start at approximately 23,000 vehicles. Even if that number was inflated, and even if half were obsolete models, even if German forces destroyed thousands in the opening months, the Soviets still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority that German tactical skill couldn't fully offset. Every German tank destroyed was a permanent loss that would take months to replace. Every Soviet tank destroyed was replaced by Soviet factories in weeks. The mathematics of attrition suggested that Germany needed to achieve decisive victory before the summer ended, before Soviet production advantages and strategic depth allowed them to stabilize the front and begin grinding down German forces through sheer weight of numbers. But Moscow was still hundreds of kilometers away. Soviet resistance was stiffening rather than collapsing. And German logistics were already showing signs of strain that would only worsen as distances increased. The initial success of Barbarossa was giving way to dawning realization that success might not be enough. August 15, 1941. Second Panzer Army Supply Depot, Western Russia. The quartermaster's report stated the problem with brutal clarity. Second Panzer Army was consuming 2.4 million liters of fuel per month, while supply lines could deliver only 1.8 million liters monthly, a deficit of 600,000 liters that was growing daily. Heinz Guderian read the numbers and understood that mathematics, not Soviet resistance, was becoming the decisive factor in the campaign. Every kilometer forward increased the distance that supply trucks had to travel, reducing the effective delivery capacity of the transport fleet, because trucks spent more time driving and less time actually delivering. Soviet partisan activity was forcing convoys to travel in escorted groups, further reducing efficiency. Fuel trucks were consuming an increasing percentage of their cargo just to make the round trip to forward units. The system was eating itself, approaching a point where supply delivery would fall to zero, not because of enemy action, but because of pure logistical geometry. Unless something changed dramatically, the Second Panzer Army would run out of fuel somewhere in western Russia, stranded hundreds of kilometers from their objectives, unable to advance or retreat effectively. Guderian's authorization in September 1941 to cannibalize reserve tanks for spare parts represented a desperate measure that revealed how severe the maintenance crisis had become. Over 200 tanks were stripped of engines, transmissions, tracks, and other components to keep the remaining vehicles operational. It was a one-way transaction, sacrificing future capability to maintain current operations, accepting that the Second Panzer Army was getting weaker every day. Tanks being cannibalized were often newer models with mechanical failures that couldn't be fixed in field conditions. Their advanced components harvested to repair older vehicles that were simpler but still functional. The practice meant that even if German forces advanced successfully, and they would do so with progressively fewer tanks regardless of combat losses, the peak strength of 1,800 tanks in June had already declined to approximately 1,400 operational vehicles by September, and the trend was accelerating. Without factory-level maintenance facilities, the entire tank force was slowly disintegrating. The Quartermaster General's report dated September 20th delivered the message that logistics officers had been trying to communicate to operational commanders for months. Second Panzer Army will have sufficient fuel for operations through October 15th. They then will be unable to conduct offensive operations without emergency resupply beyond current capacity. The report meant that Germany had approximately 3.5 weeks to achieve decisive victory before the advance would halt for lack of fuel, regardless of tactical success. Guderian and other panzer commanders argued for priority allocation of available fuel to maintain momentum, but Wehrmacht logistics were supporting multiple army groups across a 1,000-kilometer front, and there simply wasn't enough fuel for everyone. Choices had to be made about which forces would receive full supply and which would have to accept reduced operational capability. The internal competition for scarce resources was undermining the coordinated operations that Blitzkrieg Doctrine required. Main tank readiness statistics from October 1941 painted a grim picture of mechanical degradation. Only 40% of the Second Panzer Army's remaining tanks were fully operational, capable of sustained combat operations. The other 60% had varying degrees of mechanical problems, ranging from minor issues that reduced performance to major failures that limited vehicles to short-distance moves. Soviet winter weather was beginning to arrive, and temperatures below freezing created new problems that German vehicles weren't designed to handle. Oil viscosity changed in cold temperatures, making engines hard to start. Batteries lost capacity and failed. Rubber components became brittle and cracked. Cooling systems that had overheated in summer now froze. Crews discovered that vehicles sitting stationary even for a few hours in sub-zero temperatures required extensive warming procedures before they could move, and some vehicles couldn't be restarted without external heat sources. The average tank had required 1.5 major repairs since the campaign began, with some vehicles having been rebuilt multiple times and approaching total mechanical failure. German fuel production and consumption imbalances revealed strategic vulnerabilities that no amount of tactical success could overcome. The German economy in 1941 could produce approximately 630,000 tons of fuel per year from synthetic plants and limited natural oil sources. Indeed, the Wehrmacht was consuming approximately 420,000 tons per year across all branches for normal peacetime operations and training. Operation Barbarossa increased consumption to levels that exceeded domestic production by 190,000 tons per year, creating a deficit that could only be met by drawing down stockpiles or capturing enemy supplies. The stockpiles that had seemed adequate in June were being depleted by September, with no prospect of replenishment unless Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus were captured or imports increased dramatically. Germany was fighting a campaign that was literally consuming more fuel than the economy could produce, a mathematically unsustainable situation that guaranteed eventual operational paralysis regardless of tactical outcomes. And rail transport capacity became the bottleneck that limited everything else. German railways could deliver approximately 350 tons of supplies per day to forward areas in western Russia, a number that sounded substantial until compared to the Second Panzer Army's daily requirement of 1,200 tons. The gap of 850 tons daily had to be made up by truck transport, but truck convoys were consuming fuel to deliver fuel, creating inefficiencies that made the gap worse. Soviet rail infrastructure used a different track gauge than German railways, requiring either time-consuming regauging of captured tracks or transfer of supplies between different rail systems at intermediate points. Soviet retreating forces had destroyed rail facilities, locomotives, and rolling stock, further reducing capacity. Our German engineers were working constantly to restore rail lines, but they couldn't work faster than the advance was extending them. Every kilometer forward added to the rail network that needed maintenance, while simultaneously increasing the distance that supplies had to travel before reaching the front. Truck losses from Soviet air and ground action reached critical levels by autumn 1941. The Second Panzer Army had begun Barbarossa with approximately 18,000 trucks, supporting 1,800 tanks, a 10-to-1 ratio that logistics planners considered minimum for sustained operations. By October, 40% of those trucks had been destroyed, damaged beyond repair, or worn out from constant operation over terrible roads. Soviet aircraft, increasingly active as the initial German air superiority waned, targeted supply convoys as priority targets. Soviet partisan units ambushed isolated truck columns in rear areas. Mechanical breakdowns from overuse were as significant as enemy action in reducing the truck fleet. The remaining 60% of trucks had to work harder to compensate, accelerating their own degradation toward failure. Replacements were available in Germany, but couldn't be delivered to Russia fast enough to offset losses. The supply system was collapsing from the bottom up, breaking down at the tactical level, even while strategic stockpiles existed hundreds of kilometers away in depots that couldn't connect to forward units. Soviet winter temperature extremes created maintenance challenges that German planning had completely failed to anticipate. Soviet commanders understood that their winter climate was a defensive asset, and that mechanized forces from Western Europe would struggle with temperatures that Soviet equipment was designed to handle. German vehicles had cooling systems optimized for moderate European climates, lubricants that worked in temperate conditions, fuel formulations that performed adequately above freezing. When temperatures dropped to -10 or -20 Celsius, everything changed. Engines wouldn't start without extensive preheating. Fuel gelled in tanks and fuel lines. Hydraulic fluids became too viscous to function properly. Even stationary vehicles required constant maintenance just to prevent cold weather damage, consuming fuel and crew energy for no operational benefit. German logistics officers realized too late that winter operations would have required completely different equipment and procedures, and cold weather preparation that should have been implemented before the campaign began, but now couldn't be retrofitted onto damaged, exhausted vehicles in field conditions. The comparison between French campaign supply lines and Soviet campaign supply lines illustrated why Barbarossa had always been logistically problematic. The French campaign maximum supply line was 400 kilometers, challenging but manageable with available German transport capacity. By October 1941, some German units were operating 800 kilometers from the nearest major supply depot, double the French distance across worse terrain in harsher climate, against an enemy that remained capable of disrupting logistics. The mathematics of supply delivery showed that efficiency declined exponentially with distance. Doubling the distance didn't just double the fuel required, it reduced deliverable payload by roughly 60%, because trucks consume more fuel traveling longer distances. At 800 kilometers, trucks were consuming more fuel than they could deliver, turning the supply system into a net consumer rather than a provider of resources. The geometry of logistics had defeated operational capability without Soviet forces needing to win major battles. As October turned toward November and the autumn rains began turning dirt roads into impassable mud, Guderian confronted the reality that the Second Panzer Army could not reach Moscow with current resources. The city was still approximately 150 kilometers away, tantalizingly close on a map, but operationally unreachable given fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and deteriorating weather. He could see the spires and buildings in the distance through field glasses, could imagine German tanks rolling through Red Square, but the practical requirements of getting there were impossible to meet. The logistics simply didn't exist to sustain an assault on Moscow and subsequent occupation with forces in their current degraded state. The question became whether to admit this reality and recommend operational pause for consolidation, or to continue attacking in hope that some combination of luck and determination would overcome mathematical constraints. Guderian's choice would determine the Second Panzer Army's fate and potentially the outcome of the entire campaign. October 3rd, 1941. At field headquarters, western approaches to Moscow. The halt order arrived by radio in the early afternoon, terse and final. Second Panzer Army is to cease offensive operations and consolidate current positions. Prepared defensive works, further orders to follow. Heinz Guderian stood in silence for several minutes after receiving the message, understanding that this represented either temporary operational pause or the effective end of Germany's chance to capture Moscow before winter. His forces were within striking distance of the Soviet capital, closer than they would ever be again. But fuel reserves had dropped to critical levels, and tank strength had eroded to barely 700 operational vehicles from the 1,800 that had crossed the border 4 months earlier. The halt order was rational from a logistics perspective, necessary from a sustainability standpoint, but it meant abandoning the operational momentum that was Blitzkrieg's entire foundation. Guderian drafted a protest message arguing for either final push to Moscow with emergency fuel allocation or complete withdrawal to defensible winter positions, warning that halting in current locations would leave German forces vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks without the mobility to respond effectively. The message was acknowledged and ignored. The approaches to Moscow from October 15th through 24th represented the last moment when German forces might have had sufficient strength to attempt a final assault on the Soviet capital. Advanced German elements reached positions within 35 kilometers of Moscow's outer defensive zones, close enough to see the city's buildings. You need to monitor Soviet radio transmissions from Central Command to imagine what victory might look like. Soviet defenses were stiffening with every day as fresh divisions arrived from Siberia and the Far East. Units that had been held in reserve against potential Japanese attack, but were now being committed to defend the capital. Temperatures were dropping from +5 Celsius to -15 Celsius, a 20-degree shift in 2 weeks that created operational chaos as equipment failed and soldiers suffered cold weather injuries. German forces that had been advancing rapidly in September were now struggling to move at all, tanks breaking down faster than they could be repaired, fuel consumption skyrocketing as engines labored in freezing temperatures, supply trucks unable to navigate roads that had become frozen mud tracks. Guderian's diary entry for October 20th, written in a field headquarters heated only by a small stove, captured his recognition that the campaign had failed. "We have failed. The Russians have not collapsed. We are facing an enemy we cannot defeat with this force. Our tanks are worn out, our fuel is exhausted, winter is arriving before we have achieved decisive victory. I have argued for withdrawal to defensible positions, but have been overruled. We will hold where we are and hope that Soviet forces are too weak to exploit our vulnerability. This is not strategy, it is wishful thinking." The entry was unusual for Guderian, who typically maintained professional detachment in official communications. The personal admission of failure suggested how completely the situation had deteriorated from the optimistic predictions of June. Because everything that Blitzkrieg Doctrine required, speed, surprise, exploitation, rapid victory, had been attempted but proved insufficient against Soviet strategic depth and industrial capacity. The Soviet counteroffensive beginning December 5, 1941, hit German forces that were extended, exhausted, and vulnerable in ways that Soviet commanders exploited ruthlessly. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped with winter clothing and weapons designed for cold weather operations, attacked along multiple axes against German positions, held by troops suffering from frostbite, inadequate winter gear, and mechanical equipment that barely functioned in sub-zero temperatures. The attacks achieved surprise because German intelligence had underestimated Soviet reserve strength, and is assuming that the massive losses inflicted through the summer and autumn had depleted Soviet capabilities to the point where major counteroffensives were impossible. But Soviet production had replaced destroyed divisions faster than German calculations had predicted, and Stalin was willing to commit reserves that Hitler would have hoarded. The Second Panzer Army began retreating from positions it had held at such cost, giving up ground to avoid encirclement, abandoning equipment that couldn't be moved for lack of fuel or operational vehicles. Tank strength evolution from June through December told the story of attrition more clearly than battle reports. The Second Panzer Army began Operation Barbarossa with 1,800 tanks operational on June 22nd. By December 1st, only 320 tanks remained operational, an 82% loss rate over 6 months. These weren't primarily combat losses in the sense of tanks destroyed by enemy fire. Approximately 35% were combat casualties from Soviet anti-tank guns, mines, and artillery. Another 45% were mechanical casualties, tanks that had broken down and couldn't be repaired in field conditions. The remaining 20% were tanks abandoned during retreats because fuel shortages prevented their movement. The combat-to-mechanical loss ratio revealed that German forces were being defeated, as much by logistics and climate as by Soviet resistance. The tank force was disintegrating regardless of tactical outcomes, worn away by distances, temperatures, and operational tempo that exceeded sustainable levels. Temperature impacts on military operations became critical during November and December, as winter conditions overwhelmed German preparation. Tank engines failed regularly in temperatures below -20°C, requiring crews to drain oil and coolant every night to prevent freezing, then reheat and refill before the vehicle could operate in the morning. This process took hours and consumed fuel that was desperately scarce. Crews who neglected these procedures found their engines cracked and destroyed by freezing. Weapons malfunctioned as lubricants froze, requiring constant maintenance to keep rifles and machine guns operational. Soldiers suffered frostbite and cold-related injuries at rates approaching 40% of unit strength by November, is not because of combat, but because German winter clothing was inadequate for Soviet temperatures. Units that should have been combat effective were instead struggling to survive, burning furniture and ammunition crates for warmth, rationing food because supply convoys couldn't reach forward positions through snow and ice. Soviet reinforcement data revealed the strategic miscalculation at the heart of Barbarossa planning. German intelligence had estimated Soviet reserve capacity at approximately 20 to 30 divisions available for commitment after initial frontier armies were defeated. Actual Soviet deployment from September through November 1941 included over 50 fresh divisions from Siberia, Central Asia, and the Far East. Units that hadn't been engaged in the initial fighting and were at full strength with modern equipment. These forces represented strategic reserves that Soviet planning had positioned specifically to defend Moscow and other critical objectives, insurance against exactly the kind of rapid German advance that had occurred. German planning had assumed Soviet reserves were limited, and that rapid victories would prevent their effective deployment. Both assumptions proved wrong. Soviet strategic depth in manpower and industrial capacity was greater than German estimates, and Soviet command was willing to trade space for time, accepting territorial losses to preserve forces that could counterattack once German momentum was exhausted. The casualty statistics by December first showed that the Second Panzer Army had suffered 45,000 casualties, approximately 11% of total strength, with losses distributed across all categories. Combat deaths from Soviet action accounted for roughly 40%. Non-combat deaths from disease, accidents, and cold weather injuries were approximately 15%. wounded who had been evacuated represented about 30%. Missing in action, mostly prisoners captured during Soviet counterattacks, made up the remaining 15%. These numbers were manageable in percentage terms, lower than some previous campaigns, but they obscured the qualitative impact. The casualties were disproportionately experienced personnel. All were veterans of Poland and France who understood mechanized warfare and couldn't easily be replaced. Junior officers and NCOs who had led the summer advances were dead or wounded, replaced by less experienced personnel who lacked the tactical judgment that successful operations required. The Second Panzer Army was becoming weaker not just in numbers, but in capability. The fuel situation by December 1st was catastrophic, representing the culmination of logistical problems that had been developing since summer. The Second Panzer Army had approximately 2 days of fuel supply at current consumption rates, with no deliveries possible through snow-blocked roads and frozen supply lines. Tanks that might have been used for mobile defense or counterattacks sat immobile, essentially pillboxes, or because moving them would exhaust the last fuel reserves. Some units were burning furniture and personal effects to generate heat, having exhausted coal and wood supplies. Soldiers were melting snow for drinking water because fuel couldn't be spared to pump and transport water from normal sources. The mechanized army that had crossed into Russia 6 months earlier had been reduced to a static, vulnerable force barely capable of defending fixed positions, let alone conducting the mobile operations that Blitzkrieg Doctrine required. Victory had been tantalizingly close in October, but by December it was clearly impossible with available resources. German strategic options narrowed to 2 equally unappealing choices: continue holding current positions through winter in hope that spring would bring renewed offensive capability, or conduct strategic withdrawal to more defensible lines closer to supply sources and accept the territorial and psychological costs of retreat. Hitler demanded that forces hold where they were, forbidding withdrawals except in cases of imminent encirclement. Traditional generals argued for elastic defense, giving ground where necessary to preserve forces for future operations. Guderian advocated for immediate withdrawal before Soviet counteroffensives could trap German forces in untenable positions. The debate became academic when Soviet attacks began pushing German forces back, regardless of orders to hold. Retreats that should have been planned and orderly became reactive and desperate, units falling back under pressure, abandoning equipment, losing cohesion. The Second Panzer Army that had seemed invincible in June was being systematically dismantled by a combination of Soviet resistance, logistical failure, and winter conditions that German planning had failed to account for. As 1941 ended and German forces settled into winter defensive positions, hundreds of kilometers short of their objectives, the fundamental questions about Blitzkrieg Doctrine demanded answers. Could mechanized warfare succeed against opponents with strategic depth and industrial capacity exceeding Germany's resources? Had the French victory been anomaly rather than proof of concept? Success achieved against uniquely vulnerable opponent rather than universal military truth? Was the problem with Barbarossa execution, attempting to implement sound doctrine with insufficient resources? Or was the problem strategic, committing to operations that no doctrine could win given the constraints? Guderian had no definitive answers, only the uncomfortable recognition that everything he had spent a decade developing had been tested under extreme conditions and had proven insufficient. The tanks that had seemed invincible were broken. The logistics that had seemed adequate had collapsed. The enemy that should have surrendered was counterattacking. Blitzkrieg hadn't failed completely, but it hadn't succeeded either, leaving German forces trapped in a strategic stalemate that Guderian's operational brilliance couldn't resolve. January 15th, 1942. The Berghof, Bavaria. Heinz Guderian stood before Adolf Hitler in the Führer's mountain retreat, while delivering the frank assessment that he knew would probably end his active command. The Second Panzer Army cannot conduct sustained defensive operations in its current state. Tank strength is below 30% of establishment. Fuel reserves are inadequate for mobile operations. Personnel casualties and cold weather injuries have degraded combat effectiveness. I recommend consolidation, withdrawal to winter defensive lines, and suspension of offensive operations until spring at earliest. The room fell silent. Hitler's face darkened. Other officers present studied the floor or the walls, avoiding eye contact. Guderian continued because he had nothing to lose, and because someone needed to speak truth to power. We attempted an operation beyond our logistical capacity. The fault lies not with the troops, who performed magnificently, but with strategic planning that underestimated Soviet resources and overestimated German capabilities. Continuing current approach will result in progressive degradation of forces without achieving decisive results. Hitler's response was immediate and angry, revealing the dictator's unwillingness to accept that his strategic vision had encountered reality's constraints. The German army does not retreat. You speak of limitations, Guderian, when what is required is will. The Soviets are near collapse. One more effort, one more offensive, and they will break. Your pessimism is the only thing preventing victory. If you cannot lead with the necessary determination, I will find commanders who can. The confrontation continued for another hour, Guderian presenting logistical data and casualty figures, Hitler dismissing them as excuses from generals who lacked proper National Socialist spirit. Other officers attempted to mediate, suggesting compromises that might preserve both strategic flexibility and Hitler's conviction that retreat represented ideological failure. But the fundamental disagreement was unbridgeable. Guderian believed operations should match available resources. Hitler believed could overcome material constraints. By evening, the outcome was decided. Guderian's diary entry for January 16th, the day after his confrontation with Hitler, captured both resignation and relief. I have been relieved of active command. They have chosen to pursue fantasy instead of reality. And the Second Panzer Army will be led by someone more willing to attempt the impossible and less concerned with boring details like fuel tonnage and tank readiness rates. Perhaps I am wrong. Perhaps determination can substitute for logistics. But I doubt it. Physics and mathematics care nothing for willpower, and modern warfare is ultimately a contest of industrial capacity and resource management. We are losing that contest, but no one wants to hear it. I will continue serving in advisory capacity, documenting lessons learned, trying to preserve institutional knowledge for future commanders who may be more willing to learn from the failure. The detailed analysis Guderian submitted to OKH in February 1942 represented his attempt to ensure that institutional learning occurred even if his personal career was ended. The document ran to 15 pages, meticulously documenting tank losses by cause, fuel consumption versus delivery capacity, maintenance requirements versus available facilities, casualty rates across different operational environments, and comparative analysis of German versus Soviet production. The core finding was brutal in its simplicity. Germany was losing tanks and equipment at approximately 2,100 units per year across all formations, while German industry was producing only 1,300 tanks per year, creating an 800-unit annual deficit. No tactical brilliance could overcome this mathematical reality. German forces were getting progressively weaker in absolute terms, regardless of battlefield victories. The only solution was either dramatically increase production, which would require resource allocations Germany couldn't provide, or reduced operational tempo, which would sacrifice the initiative and allow enemies to rebuild faster than Germany could attack. Hitler's response to Guderian's analysis was a single-page dismissal that revealed how completely strategic decision-making had become divorced from operational reality. The response acknowledged the statistics but insisted they were defeatist interpretations of temporary challenges. Soviet production would collapse once German forces captured key industrial regions. Tank losses would decline once better tactics were employed. Personnel quality would compensate for numerical disadvantages. The response concluded by warning that further pessimistic assessments would be interpreted as undermining military morale and dealt with accordingly. It was a remarkable document in its detachment from reality, an assertion that Germany could will itself to victory despite all evidence suggesting that material constraints made victory impossible. Guderian filed the response and stopped submitting formal assessments, recognizing that leadership didn't want analysis. They wanted confirmation of pre-existing beliefs. Directive 41, issued April 5, 1942, outlined summer offensive operations in southern Russia, targeting Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Guderian was excluded from operational planning despite being one of Germany's most experienced mechanized warfare commanders. The directive's operational concepts bore similarities to Blitzkrieg Doctrine, rapid advances, encirclement operations, and exploitation of breakthroughs, but without addressing the logistics problems that had defeated the Moscow offensive. Fuel reserves were inadequate for the distances involved. Tank strength had been partially rebuilt, but remained below establishment. The assumption that German forces could sustain operations across even greater distances than the previous year's failed Moscow campaign seemed to validate Guderian's warnings about fantasy replacing planning. But he was no longer in position to influence strategy, relegated to advisory roles where his expertise was sought on technical matters, but ignored on strategic questions. Tank production versus loss statistics for 1942 illustrated the sustainability crisis Guderian had identified. German industry produced 1,300 tanks total in 1942, and a modest increase from previous years, but still woefully inadequate. Wehrmacht losses across all theaters totaled 2,100 tanks in the same period, creating an 800 tank deficit that meant German armor strength was declining despite production. Every campaign eroded capabilities that couldn't be fully restored before the next campaign began. The mathematics suggested that Germany could sustain perhaps 2 or 3 more major operations before tank forces fell below minimally effective levels. After that, German military would lose the mechanized advantage that had made Blitzkrieg possible, reverting to infantry-based operations where Soviet numerical superiority would dominate. Guderian had identified this trajectory in his February analysis, but leadership chose to ignore it, and gambling that quick victories could be achieved before resource exhaustion became critical. Wehrmacht strength statistics showed an army that was numerically larger in June 1942 than it had been a year earlier, but qualitatively weaker in critical capabilities. Total personnel strength had increased from 2.7 million in January 1942 to 2.9 million by June through mobilization and transfers from occupation duties. But this numerical growth masked severe capability degradation. Tank strength was declining. Experienced officers and NCOs had been replaced by the less capable personnel. Logistics infrastructure was still recovering from the previous year's overextension. The increase in infantry divisions couldn't compensate for decreased mechanized capability because infantry-based operations couldn't achieve the operational tempo that Blitzkrieg required. Germany was becoming weaker in the capabilities that mattered for its chosen way of war, even as headline numbers suggested growth. The comparison between Guderian's proposed mobile defense with flexibility and Hitler's mandated hold every position at all costs doctrine represented fundamentally incompatible visions of how to fight the war in the East. Guderian advocated allowing tactical withdrawals to preserve forces, conducting counterattacks from positions of strength, trading space for time when necessary, and prioritizing destruction of enemy forces over holding terrain. This approach was consistent with traditional German military doctrine and matched the operational realities of fighting a resource-rich enemy across vast distances. Hitler's approach forbade voluntary withdrawal, demanded defense of every position regardless of tactical situation, and interpreted retreat as ideological failure rather than operational necessity. The two approaches couldn't be reconciled, and Hitler's authority meant his approach prevailed regardless of professional military opinion. Soviet versus German casualty comparisons revealed why the war was strategically unwinnable for Germany despite tactical superiority. The Second Panzer Army and associated formations had inflicted approximately 2.1 million Soviet casualties from June 1941 through December 1942. An impressive kill ratio that in previous wars would have guaranteed victory, but Soviet losses of 280,000 German casualties in the same period represented a roughly 7-to-1 exchange ratio that favored Germany tactically, but Soviet Union strategically. Soviet population and mobilization capacity allowed them to replace 2 million casualties and continue fighting. German population and industrial base struggled to replace 280,000 casualties without degrading force quality. The tactical victory was Pyrrhic when strategic sustainability was considered. Germany was winning battles but losing the war of attrition, exactly the scenario Guderian had warned about, and exactly what Hitler refused to accept. As summer 1942 approached and Guderian remained sidelined from operational command and relegated to advisory positions and training responsibilities, the tragedy of the situation became apparent. Germany's most innovative mechanized warfare theorist, the commander who had proven blitzkrieg could work in practice, was excluded from decision-making because he insisted on matching operations to available resources. Meanwhile, commanders who promised to achieve impossible objectives with inadequate means were given authority and resources for campaigns that would fail for exactly the reasons Guderian had identified. The institutional disconnect between operational reality and strategic fantasy was complete, and there was no mechanism for correcting it within a totalitarian system where the dictator's wishes overruled professional military judgment. Guderian could only watch as the Wehrmacht committed to operations he knew were unsustainable, documenting failures for historical record while being powerless to prevent them. July 12, 1942. Second Panzer Army Field Headquarters, Southern Russia. Field Marshal Walter Model assumed command of the Second Panzer Army, with instructions to prepare for offensive operations toward Stalingrad, inheriting an organization that bore Guderian's imprint, but no longer operated under his leadership. Model was capable, experienced, and willing to execute orders that Guderian would have questioned. He read the operations plan, noted the logistics challenges, calculated the probable outcomes, and then proceeded with the attack, because that was what professional soldiers did in Germany's military system. The contrast with Guderian's approach was subtle but significant. Where Guderian had pushed back against operational plans he believed were unsustainable, Model implemented them with maximum efficiency and accepted that success or failure depended on factors beyond his control. It was the difference between innovative leadership that challenged strategic assumptions and competent management that executed orders regardless of personal reservations. The Second Panzer Army remained effective under Model's command, but it had become a tool rather than an organization, led by someone who had created its doctrine. So the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented the Second Panzer Army's last major offensive operation and revealed how much German mechanized warfare capabilities had degraded since the French campaign 3 years earlier. The Second Army was assigned to the northern pincer of a massive double envelopment designed to destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. Model commanded 900 tanks, barely half the strength Guderian had led into France, facing Soviet defenses that had been prepared for months with intelligence about German plans. The offensive began July 5th and ground forward against determined resistance, making limited progress at heavy cost. Soviet defenses incorporated lessons learned from 3 years of fighting German armor. Deep defensive zones, extensive minefields, anti-tank guns positioned in depth, armor reserves held for counterattacks rather than static defense. German tactical advantages that had overwhelmed France and Poland were insufficient against an enemy that had studied German methods and developed effective countermeasures. The retreat through Ukraine from 1943 through 44 demonstrated that the Second Panzer Army could no longer execute the mobile defense that Guderian had advocated. Hitler's no-retreat orders forced the army to defend positions that were tactically indefensible, absorbing casualties without achieving operational objectives. Model attempted to implement flexible defense within the constraints of political orders, conducting local withdrawals disguised as repositioning or straightening the line, but the fundamental problem remained. Soviet forces had achieved operational tempo advantages that Germany had possessed in 1941, advancing rapidly, encircling German positions, exploiting breakthroughs before defenders could react. The roles had reversed, with Germany defending against Soviet blitzkrieg rather than conducting it against slower opponents. The Second Panzer Army fought skillfully in countless small engagements, but couldn't reverse strategic momentum. Guderian's appointment as Inspector of Panzer Forces in March 1944 gave him responsibility for tank development, production priorities, and training doctrine, but no operational command authority. He could observe the Second Panzer Army's operations from headquarters in Germany, reading reports, reviewing casualty statistics, analyzing what had become of the organization he had created. It was a frustrating position, seeing the army struggle with exactly the problems he had predicted, watching commanders make decisions he disagreed with, being powerless to influence outcomes. He pushed for increased production, improved maintenance facilities, better training. But these were long-term solutions to immediate crises. The Second Panzer Army needed tanks, fuel, and personnel now, not promises about improved capabilities next year. Guderian documented lessons learned and submitted recommendations that were sometimes implemented and often ignored, playing a supporting role in a war that had moved beyond his ability to influence. Tank strength decline from 1941 through 45 told the story of institutional degradation. As the Second Panzer Army had commanded 1,800 tanks at Operation Barbarossa's start, the peak of its capability. By Kursk in July 1943, strength had declined to 900 tanks, half the previous peak. By mid-1944, during the retreat through Ukraine, operational strength averaged 500 to 600 tanks, depending on recent battles and maintenance backlogs. By early 1945, in final defensive operations, the Second Panzer Army could field perhaps 200 to 300 tanks, barely more than a single division from its heyday. The decline reflected both combat losses and production failures. Germany couldn't replace losses fast enough to maintain strength. Again, what replacement tanks were produced had to be distributed across all formations, rather than concentrated in elite units. Composition changes in the Second Panzer Army's inventory revealed how equipment shortages forced doctrinal compromises. By 1943, approximately 40% of the Army's armored vehicles were assault guns rather than tanks, tracked vehicles with fixed forward-firing guns that provided firepower but lacked the tactical flexibility of turreted tanks. Assault guns were cheaper and faster to produce than proper tanks, making them attractive from an industrial standpoint, but they were less maneuverable in combat and poorly suited to the mobile warfare that Blitzkrieg doctrine required. The shift from tanks to assault guns represented adaptation to production constraints, sacrificing capability to maintain some semblance of armored strength. It was a compromise that would have been unnecessary if German industry had matched Soviet production capacity, but such capacity had never existed and wasn't going to be developed while fighting a multi-front war. Soviet armor improvements by 1943 had fundamentally altered the technical balance between German and Soviet forces. The T-3485, appearing in significant numbers by late 1943, mounted an 85mm gun that could penetrate any German tank's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. It retained the excellent mobility and sloped armor that had made earlier T-34s effective, while adding firepower that made it superior to German Panzer Mark IVs and competitive with newer German designs. Our Soviet industry was producing thousands of these vehicles monthly, creating numerical superiority backed by technical parity or advantage. German responses like the Panther tank and Tiger tank were individually superior, but produced in such small numbers that they couldn't offset Soviet mass production. The Second Panzer Army increasingly faced tactical situations where Soviet armor was both more numerous and qualitatively equivalent or superior, reversing the advantages that had made German victories possible in earlier campaigns. Casualty rates for the Second Panzer Army accelerated dramatically as the war progressed and German advantages eroded. The Army suffered 85,000 casualties in 1942 during defensive and limited offensive operations. The casualties increased to 142,000 in 1943 as Soviet offensives intensified, and German defensive positions were repeatedly overrun. By 1944, casualties reached 210,000, more than double the 1942 rate, reflecting the Army's increasing vulnerability and the intensity of fighting during the general German retreat. These weren't sustainable losses. The Second Panzer Army's personnel strength fluctuated as replacements arrived and units were reorganized, but the overall trend was decline. Experienced soldiers were being killed or wounded faster than replacements could be trained and integrated, degrading unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. and his comparative rankings of German military formations by the General Staff showed the Second Panzer Army's decline from elite status to increasingly marginal effectiveness. In 1940, after the French campaign, the Second Panzer Army was rated number 1 among all Wehrmacht formations, the most capable and best equipped force Germany possessed. By 1942, it had slipped to 3rd place as other formations received priority for replacements and equipment. By 1943, it ranked 6th, reflecting cumulative losses and reduced operational capability. By 1944, the ranking had fallen to 8th as newer formations, and SES divisions received better equipment and personnel. By 1945, in final defensive battles, the Second Panzer Army ranked 12th among German forces. Now a shadow of its former capability, fighting with makeshift equipment and understrength units. The decline paralleled Germany's overall military degradation, but was particularly stark for an organization that had once represented the cutting edge of modern warfare. The inability to implement Guderian's mobile defense doctrine represented an institutional failure with strategic consequences. Guderian had argued since early 1942 that Germany's best chance against Soviet numerical superiority was flexible defense, withdrawing from untenable positions, counterattacking from strength, preserving forces for decisive battles rather than defending every meter of ground. This approach required accepting territorial losses temporarily to maintain force integrity for eventual counteroffensives. But Hitler's ideological commitment to holding ground prevented implementation of mobile defense, forcing the Second Panzer Army to fight in ways that maximized casualties and minimized operational flexibility. Units that could have withdrawn and counterattacked were instead surrounded and destroyed, defending positions that had no strategic value. The tactical competence remained, but strategic constraints prevented it from being employed effectively. As the war entered its final year in 1945, and the Second Panzer Army fought desperate defensive battles against overwhelming Soviet forces, the contrast with 1940 was almost incomprehensible. The organization that had crossed the Meuse River, raced to Abbeville, and redefined mechanized warfare was now struggling to defend river lines in eastern Germany against enemies employing the same operational concepts Guderian had pioneered. Soviet forces conducted rapid breakthroughs, deep penetrations, and encirclement operations, while German forces defended in ways that previous French or Soviet defenders had attempted unsuccessfully. The wheel had turned completely, with Germany experiencing what it had inflicted on others, fighting an enemy that had learned from defeat and now possessed both doctrinal sophistication and material superiority. The Second Panzer Army's story had become a tragedy, not through incompetence or cowardice, but through strategic decisions that committed capable forces to unsustainable operations against enemies who could absorb losses and continue fighting. Guderian's absence from command during this period meant the army fought without the innovative leadership that had created it, reduced to competent execution of inadequate strategies in a war that Germany had already lost, strategically even while still fighting tactically. Summer 1946. A prisoner of war camp, Bavaria. Heinz Guderian sat across a table from British and American military historians, discussing the campaigns he had planned and led, trying to explain how Blitzkrieg had worked and why it had ultimately failed. The former general, now a prisoner awaiting uncertain fate, spoke with surprising candor about operational successes and strategic failures. He acknowledged that mechanized warfare doctrine had revolutionized tactical combat, yes, proving that speed and coordination could overwhelm numerically superior forces. But he also admitted that doctrine alone couldn't overcome industrial capacity imbalances and strategic overreach. The interviewer asked what he would have done differently if given another chance. Guderian paused, considering the question carefully. I would have argued more forcefully against Barbarossa. The operation was beyond our logistical capacity from the beginning. France was winnable because it matched our capabilities. The Soviet Union was not. We attempted the impossible and destroyed ourselves trying. The admission was remarkable from a man known for aggressive operational thinking, a recognition that boldness had limits defined by resources and geography. The comparison between Guderian's strategic recommendations in 1941 and actual German strategy from 42 through 45 revealed a road not taken that might have prolonged the war or changed its outcome. Guderian had advocated consolidation after failing to capture Moscow, withdrawing to defensible lines, rebuilding mechanized forces, and conducting mobile defense to preserve German strength while inflicting maximum casualties on Soviet offensives. Actual German strategy under Hitler's direction emphasized holding ground at all costs, conducting offensives with inadequate resources, and refusing tactical withdrawals even when strategically sensible. Guderian's approach wouldn't have won the war. German industrial and manpower limitations made victory probably impossible once the United States entered the conflict, but it might have prevented some catastrophic encirclements, extended the war by months or years, and resulted in fewer total German casualties by avoiding futile defensive battles. The counterfactual speculation was endless, but the core point was that strategic flexibility might have achieved better outcomes than ideological rigidity did. Soviet General Konstantin Rokossovsky's post-war assessment of German operational methods provided enemy perspective on what had made Guderian's approaches effective and what had limited them. Rokossovsky, who had fought against German panzer forces throughout the war, acknowledged that German mechanized warfare doctrine in 1940 and 41 had been genuinely innovative and terrifying. The speed and coordination had created paralysis in Soviet command structures initially, making effective response almost impossible. But Rokossovsky also noted that German success depended on circumstances that didn't always exist: surprise, enemy unpreparedness, favorable terrain, short distances. Once Soviet forces adapted, built defenses in depth, and developed their own mechanized capabilities, German operational advantages diminished significantly. Rokossovsky's analysis concluded that blitzkrieg was a powerful doctrine, but not a universal solution. Most effective against unprepared opponents in limited theaters, less effective in extended campaigns against adaptable enemies with strategic depth. Modern military adoption of mechanized warfare concepts validated Guderian's fundamental insights while learning from German failures. NATO's air-land battle doctrine, developed in the 1980s, explicitly incorporated blitzkrieg principles: rapid maneuver, deep penetration, disruption of enemy command and control, exploitation before defenders could react. But NATO doctrine also addressed logistics sustainment in ways that German practice had neglected, ensuring that rapid advances didn't outrun supply capabilities. American military theorists studying Guderian's campaigns emphasized the importance of matching operational tempo to logistical capacity, avoiding the overextension that had doomed Barbarossa. Chinese military planners developing mechanized forces in the late 20th century studied Guderian's organizational innovations, particularly the integration of combined arms teams and decentralized mission-type command. The doctrine survived its German failure because the core insights were valid, even though specific implementation had been strategically misguided. Tank evolution from 1945 to the present demonstrated how post-war military technology incorporated lessons from blitzkrieg campaigns. Modern main battle tanks prioritized mobility and firepower in ways that reflected Guderian's emphasis on operational tempo and combined arms integration. Radio communications became standard, fulfilling Guderian's vision of coordinated action through instantaneous information sharing. Tank doctrine shifted from infantry support to independent maneuver formations capable of operational-level missions. The technical specifications changed dramatically: composite armor, smoothbore guns, thermal optics, digital fire control, but the conceptual framework remained recognizably descended from Guderian's innovations. The vehicles and technologies were 21st century, but the operational concepts traced directly to ideas developed in the 1930s and tested in combat from 39 through 45. Soviet operational innovation built on Guderian's concepts while developing distinct approaches suited to Soviet strengths. Deep battle doctrine, codified in 1936 before Guderian's ideas were fully implemented, shared conceptual similarities with blitzkrieg. Rapid penetration, operational depth, in the exploitation of breakthroughs. But Soviet doctrine emphasized mass more than speed, accepting that Soviet forces might be slower and less technically sophisticated than potential enemies, while compensating through overwhelming numbers and industrial capacity. Post-1945, Soviet military theorists studied German operational successes and failures, incorporating lessons about mechanized warfare while adapting them to Soviet circumstances. The result was doctrine that reflected both Soviet and German influences, creating synthesis that would define Cold War military competition. Guderian's influence on Soviet thinking was indirect but significant, his successes providing templates to emulate and his failures offering warnings about overextension. Counterfactual analysis of what might have happened if Guderian had retained command in 1942 and implemented mobile defense doctrine suggested alternative historical trajectories. Historians estimating potential outcomes calculated that flexible defense might have reduced German casualties by 15 to 35% through avoiding encirclements and preserving forces for counterattacks. The Eastern Front might have stabilized along defensible river lines rather than constantly shifting westward. Soviet offensives might have advanced more slowly against mobile German defense than against static positions. But these potential advantages had to be weighed against political costs. Territorial losses would have been greater temporarily. Civilian populations would have been abandoned to Soviet occupation earlier, and Hitler's ideological framework would have been violated in ways that might have provoked leadership crisis. The military advantages of Guderian's approach were clear, but implementing them would have required political changes that weren't feasible in Nazi Germany's system. Production analysis revealed the fundamental constraint that no operational doctrine could overcome. Germany would have needed to produce approximately 400 tanks per month to sustain Barbarossa while maintaining strength, compared to actual capacity of 140 tanks monthly. The gap of 260 tanks per month represented roughly 3 billion Reichsmarks of additional annual industrial investment, resources that didn't exist and couldn't be created without sacrificing other military or civilian programs. And even if Guderian had designed perfect operational plans, even if German tactics had been flawless, the industrial capacity simply didn't support sustained mechanized warfare against enemies with superior production. The Soviet Union produced approximately 2,400 tanks monthly by 1943. The United States produced roughly 2,000 tanks monthly by 1944. Germany, at peak production in 1944, reached 300 tanks monthly, a dramatic improvement from earlier years, but still woefully inadequate against combined Allied production. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome 10-to-1 production disadvantages over sustained campaigns. Guderian's cultural impact on military thinking extended beyond specific doctrinal innovations to broader questions about how military organizations adapt and innovate. He became the archetype of the thinking soldier, the officer who questioned established doctrine and developed new approaches based on technological possibilities rather than historical precedent. Post-war military education incorporated case studies of how Guderian had challenged cavalry-dominated thinking in the 1920s and 30s, developing mechanized warfare concepts despite institutional resistance. The lesson emphasized wasn't that Guderian's specific ideas were correct, some worked, others failed, but that military organizations needed to encourage innovative thinking even when it challenged comfortable assumptions. Soviet military academies taught Guderian's campaigns both as operational case studies and as examples of how doctrinal innovation could create temporary advantages that dissipated once enemies adapted. The name Guderian became synonymous with military innovation in ways that transcended the specific German context. The question of whether Guderian lost the war through operational decisions or whether Hitler's refusal to accept Guderian's strategic advice ensured Germany would lose it generated endless debate among military historians. Arguments that Guderian bore responsibility pointed to his aggressive operational style in 1941, his willingness to advance beyond sustainable supply lines, his tendency to prioritize tactical success over logistical caution. These aggressive tendencies, while producing stunning victories in France, arguably contributed to overextension in Russia, Counter-arguments emphasize that Guderian had warned about Barbarossa's unsustainability, had advocated withdrawal and consolidation when logistics collapsed, and had been overruled by Hitler at critical moments. From this perspective, Guderian's removal from command in 1942 represented institutional failure to listen to professional military judgment, ensuring that Germany would continue pursuing unsustainable strategies until defeat became inevitable. The truth likely incorporated both perspectives. Guderian's operational boldness sometimes exceeded prudent limits, but Hitler's strategic rigidity prevented adaptation when boldness failed to achieve quick victory. What would modern warfare look like if blitzkrieg had never been invented? The question invited speculation about alternative military evolution. Perhaps mechanized forces would have developed more slowly, remaining tied to infantry support, rather than independent operational formations. Perhaps the Second World War would have featured trench warfare similar to 1914 through 18, with higher casualties and longer duration. Perhaps air power would have assumed greater importance earlier if ground forces hadn't demonstrated the decisive potential of mechanized maneuver. Or perhaps other innovators would have developed similar concepts independently. Soviet deep battle, British experimental mechanized divisions, then American cavalry mechanization efforts all suggested that technological possibility drove doctrinal innovation across multiple militaries. Guderian's contribution was accelerating and refining mechanized warfare doctrine, proving it worked in practice. But the underlying concepts probably would have emerged regardless, because technology created opportunities that militaries inevitably exploited. As the interview concluded and Guderian prepared to return to his cell, the historian asked one final question. "Do you regret your role in developing blitzkrieg?" Guderian considered silently for a long moment. "I regret serving a regime that used military innovations for evil purposes. I regret that my operational successes prolonged a war that should have ended sooner, but I don't regret developing mechanized warfare doctrine itself. The concepts were valid. The execution in France demonstrated their potential. The failure in Russia showed their limits. If another generation of soldiers can learn from both the successes and the failures, perhaps some good can come from the tragedy. Military innovation is neither good nor evil. It's a tool. The morality comes from the purposes it serves. I developed the tool. Others chose how to use it. I will bear my share of responsibility for that. But I won't apologize for understanding how modern technology changed warfare. That understanding was necessary. How it was employed was the crime." The legacy of Guderian's Second Panzer Army, then, was complex and ambiguous. It demonstrated that innovative doctrine could multiply combat effectiveness, that organizational structure mattered as much as equipment, that speed and coordination could overcome numerical disadvantage. It also demonstrated that doctrine had limits, that logistics ultimately determined what operations were sustainable, that industrial capacity constrained what tactics could achieve over extended campaigns. The lessons resonated through decades of subsequent military development, informing NATO, planning during the Cold War, shaping Israeli armored doctrine, influencing American operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The specific German campaigns from 1939 through 45 became historical footnotes, but the underlying concepts remained relevant whenever military professionals thought about mechanized warfare, combined arms integration, or operational tempo. Guderian had invented modern armored warfare, proven it could work, and revealed its limitations. That was the legacy, neither triumphant nor entirely tragic, but deeply instructive about how military innovation succeeds, fails, and ultimately influences warfare's evolution long after the specific historical circumstances that generated it have passed into history.